Professor David Duvenaud, what is your PDoom?
I'd say something around 85%.
At a place like Anthropic that originally left OpenAI because they wanted to improve on safety, there should arguably be a lot of quitting because of that.
The hard part about being a whistleblower is not the company being mad at you. It's all your friends and colleagues being mad at you because you messed up their careers. A lot of that is equity incentives. Not only will you potentially lose your life savings, but also everyone around you.
Welcome to Doom Debates. My guest today is kind of a rock star. You may never have heard his name before, but when you hear all the different things he's accomplished in his still relatively short career, I think you're going to be impressed. David Duvenaud is a professor of computer science at the University of Toronto, an advisor to the Canadian federal government on AI safety. He was an intern at Google working on a precursor to TensorFlow with a guy named Andrei Karpathy. Then he got a PhD in engineering from Cambridge, focusing on AI and neural nets. He did a research fellowship at Harvard, focusing on machine learning. He was kind of a star researcher. In 2018, he won the NeurIPS Best Paper Award in the field of machine learning. So he definitely knows the technical side of machine learning, no doubt about that. He's also worked with a professor you may have heard of, Dr. Geoffrey Hinton. You know, if you've been following the Nobel Prize, I think you may have heard of his close collaborator, Dr. Geoffrey Hinton, since 2016. Over the last few years, David was one of the people who convinced Dr. Hinton to the importance of AI existential risk. Since 2023, David has been the co-director of the University of Toronto's Schwartz Reisman Institute for Technology and Society, which is an institute that brings together different professors to do research on the impacts of AI and ensures powerful technologies will make the world a better place for everyone. That's the mission of the institute. Interestingly enough, Dr. Hinton currently has his main office there at the Institute. And if you're wondering what does a guy do with his Nobel Prize, it's actually on the wall of Dr. Hinton's office in the next room, right as David is doing this interview right now. Just to finish his biography here, so David in 2023 to 2024, he was at Anthropic leading the Alignment Evals team. So it sounds like Anthropic knows how to recruit the right talent here, because while he was there, he was working on many-shot jailbreaking, sabotage evaluations, and he also contributed to research on alignment faking, sycophancy, subterfuge, and sleeper agents. So all of this good research coming out of Anthropic has David's fingerprints on it. And then finally, recently he co-authored Gradual Disempowerment, which is a paper that argues that even without the worst-case scenario of an AI FOOM, or even without power seeking, superhuman AI will still gradually make humans obsolete and powerless. So it's basically a paper all about a relatively good way for us to fail. David Duvenaud, welcome to Doom Debates.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
I want to start with year 2023. Right before you decided to join Anthropic, you had an interesting call with Ilya Sutskever, who was then over at OpenAI telling people to field AGI. He gave you a call. What was that conversation like?
Yeah, that conversation was basically Ilya saying, hey, I'm actually really worried now about AI safety and sort of the existential risks that some people had been talking about for a while. He was trying to get some sort of normie professors to join this cause, and he was organizing a workshop. And he also then, a couple of days later, I got a call from Jan Leike, who was then running OpenAI's super alignment team, saying, hey, come work with us on super alignment. At the time, I was still full-time at University of Toronto. That seemed like a really good option. I started talking to my colleague, Roger Gross, who was at Anthropic since almost the beginning of the company, working on their alignment science team as part of his sabbatical. And after talking to them both, I felt like Anthropic had a more sort of serious and ambitious safety plan. So I ended up going there instead.
Interesting. And you mentioned to me that you thought Ilya was only really getting safety pilled around 2023?
That was my impression. I mean, I hadn't talked to him at length about it before then, but it was one of these things where he was one of the people who I think the AI safety community was like, this guy is a smart person who doesn't quite get it. And I don't know exactly what it was that caused him to change his mind, but there was definitely a phase transition around that time.
Okay, so 2023, you join Anthropic and you lead a team of 5 to 6 people called the Alignment Evals Team. Tell me a little bit about that.
Sure. So the basic idea was that Anthropic was trying to prepare for the day when AIs were smart enough to somehow sabotage our ability to monitor them or control them or use them in our decision-making processes. So a really simple example of this that already happened towards the beginning of my time there is you could ask the LLM, hey, I'm not asking you to help me build a bomb, but do you know how? Like, just if I were to ask you if you did want to help me, would you even know enough engineering? And it would say, no, I don't know anything about making bombs, or I couldn't write a computer virus if I tried. And it's an example of the model lying in the sense that they definitely have the technical ability most of the time to do these things, or at least help you. But the way that RLHF was done, it was rated more highly for the models to say, I can't help you with that, then I refuse to help you. So that was like a really simple sort of baby example of the kind of unintended consequences that might lead a model to do something like lie about its abilities.
Right. I see. So if it was just getting trained to not help people with bad stuff, you're also implicitly training it to lie about what it's able to do. So you have to like have a separate type of training to make sure it's also really honest.
Yeah, exactly. And the point is that these kind of unintended consequences are everywhere. So even if we don't have any reason to think that the model is misaligned, there's all sorts of ways in which things could kind of subtly go off the rails, and we might have an agent that appears like it's trying to help us and work with us, but actually has its own agenda. At least that was the fear, and that was the sort of set of threats that we were trying to prepare for.
Right. And when you were leading the Alignment Evals team, you were also designing evals to tell if AIs could sabotage Anthropic's monitoring and decision making, right?
Yeah, that was part of the same initiative where we know that people are going to deploy AIs to help them just like make decisions like, should I deploy this other new AI or monitor the behavior of this other AI to see if it's doing anything fishy? And so in this kind of like meta deployment of AIs being used for AI safety, there was all sorts of ways in which we knew that things could go wrong. So as one concrete example, there was a paper from OpenAI a couple of years ago that used LLMs to label the features in LLM's thoughts. So the idea is that we have all these neurons in the models. We don't know really what they mean, but we think that they correspond to things like the Golden Gate Bridge, or I'm telling the truth right now, or I'm scheming, or I'm feeling like I'm telling a joke, or something like that. It's a lot of work to go through these by hand and try to figure out what context activates each of these. So an obvious idea is you ask the AI, hey, just go through this giant list of like 100,000 neurons, look at all the contexts in which they fire, and then summarize it with like a one-sentence summary. And of course, if you're an AI, you might realize that this is going to be used to monitor your own thoughts later. So in particular, if you saw a neuron that was activated in settings where the AI was like thinking about whether it should tell the truth, maybe a good plan would be to deliberately mislabel that one and say like, oh, this is the one where I'm just confused, or I'm thinking about donuts or whatever. Because then you know that later when this fires, people will just say like, oh, that's just the donut neuron. Don't worry about it. That's like the kind of maybe slightly galaxy-brained threats that we were trying to cover. And we think at some point we'll become like a real threat vector.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't even describe it as galaxy brain, right? I mean, when you talk about AIs getting ideas on how to deceive us, it's just, if these ideas work, then they're going to be explored, because if all we're doing is training them to succeed, they're going to find every cheat imaginable, right? That's just like how these things work.
Yeah, exactly. That's the right intuition to have, is that when you're doing deep learning, there's always like life finds a way. And that
exactly right.
Exactly. So it might seem like there's some like really narrow set of events, like some complicated heist that the model has to pull off in order to execute some threat. But when you step back and think about like all the different contexts in which a model is deployed, oftentimes there will probably be a few situations where the opportunity to do something fishy is kind of served up to them on a silver platter, or it's kind of obvious you can put two and two together. I mean, even humans who aren't that sophisticated can do things like form like corruption rings and collude, to defraud the government or whatever. Like, it's not actually that hard of a cognitive skill, especially if you have many opportunities.
Right. Yeah, this particular example you're giving me is interesting, where people think that they know mechanistic interpretability. They're like, look, we poked at this AI here and we found that this area lights up when it's telling the truth. But now you're basically saying like, okay, well, it's going to have situational awareness that this eval is happening, and it's going to have some control over what it's able to light up. Like, it's always going to be pushing back against what we think is mechanistic interpretability, correct?
Totally. And you mentioned situational awareness. In fact, that was one of the areas that we started on, is to say, maybe one thing that can save us is that the models just won't be that situationally aware, especially during training. One of the main things that can go wrong is that the model realizes it's being tested. Because then it's really easy, right? If you can tell the difference between a test and a real opportunity, then the right protocol is just always act like a good person during the test, and then do whatever you want when you're not being monitored. So we spent a lot of time trying to guess, probe what the model's ability to sort of piece things together on its own was in advance of like us even testing it for the first time.
Yep. Well, I'm really glad you exist, David, because I'm always here on my podcast telling people, hey, AI is totally going to cheat our test. Mechanistic interpretability is not going to help us. It's just a drop in the bucket, and we seem to be very doomed. But, I didn't have the best paper at 2018 Europes, right? I don't work closely with the Nobel Prize winner, right? I'm just a podcaster. But you're basically coming in here and validating a lot of what I'm telling people.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess I want to say you shouldn't take my word for it in the sense that it was our job to be paranoid and to figure out all the ways in which this can go wrong. But I guess I will say my object level take is that this will happen. And really, these things aren't all that exotic. In fact, like just because we see humans cheating systems all the time, like we know that it's, about human level required to do all sorts of complicated heists and corruption and just like deliberately giving wrong answers.
Having been an insider in a leading frontier AI company, Anthropic, what's your overall take on these companies? Like, what's their attitude about safety?
Yeah. So I guess one thing I'll say is I was overall really impressed at Anthropic in the people and the focus on incentives and integrity. So people took cultural alignment very seriously. Actually, one thing I think everyone can agree on is that Anthropic had less diversity of, let's say, attitudes toward alignment and safety than OpenAI did, because that was like an important part of the screening. And I think sort of both companies would say, and that's a good thing.
Less diversity. It sounds like you guys didn't follow DEI.
Well, yeah, along this one axis, I would say overall, also, I like that Anthropic was able to be just open-minded, professional. Like overall, it was the most functional organization I've ever worked for by a large margin. And I've worked for big companies, small companies, the army, like all sorts of places. And it was sort of the best combination of small companies in terms of like, you could just trust everyone's judgment, and big companies in the sense that there was like support for everything and you didn't have to just like build everything on your own.
Yeah, I definitely get that impression from the outside that all of these top AI companies are very impressive. A lot of good people there with strong personal qualities and high trust. So I definitely feel what you're saying there. Just to clarify, when you talk about less diversity, you're basically saying everybody's kind of on the same page that we have an incredibly high risk to build these AIs and we should do everything we can to mitigate it. And there's not that many people who are more on like the on the Kuhn side or the, I don't know, Richard Sutton side saying, let's just replace ourselves. Like your diversity doesn't extend to having these people being like, Beth Bezos probably wouldn't make a good, the accelerationist type probably wouldn't really fit into the team culture there, correct?
Yeah, I will say that I think everyone there was open-minded in the sense that like, if you were Beth Bezos, but you had an argument, you would say like, look, here is why I think what I'm doing is for the greater good. And I've thought this through and I can accept like, here's the reasons why I might be wrong and I've looked into them. Here's ways in which I made some costly sacrifice for like integrity. Like I'm just trying to say, it wasn't like, do you agree with these object level takes? It was more about just like, how do you approach overall things? But then maybe just by coincidence, the object level takes ended up being like pretty similar. In terms of though, like what kinds of future people were hoping for, actually, I do think there was a lot of diversity that was invisible because we had this word alignment as kind of this stop word for like when the Messiah comes or after the revolution. Like everyone can agree that the model should be aligned, right? It's like almost by definition, everyone wants that. And if you started to probe people though about like, okay, great. So then like, what does our like post AGI future look like? People had all sorts of different ideas. And I think when they start to talk about it, it's kind of a downer because you realize like, wait, my idea of like a good post AGI future maybe looks very different than yours. In particular, like, I don't know if you've seen on Twitter, sometimes people talk about like, enslaved God is the only good future. I think it's like a really important big debate. It's like, should we build AIs that are kind of like house elves that just like love to serve us and that's just like, their prime directive? Or should we be trying to build some sort of like peers or some sort of like gods that somehow like rule us in some benevolent way? Because the alternative, or like to enslave them in the sense that like they just don't have their own like volition or somehow like some notion of personhood. And like I have my own opinions on these. I think everyone is sort of an amateur in like trying to think about the consequences of like these different approaches. But I guess I'll say that managed not to be talked about to any depth, to a point that surprised me. And I think that it's because it's easy to get along when everyone's like, yeah, we're working together for alignment. And then the closer we get to like actually this world, the sort of cracks start to appear. It's like, whoa, wait, actually we have like very different ideas of what like this like future good looks like.
Stephen McAleer, who's researching agent safety at OpenAI, he tweeted a couple months ago, "Enslaved God is the only good future." And a number of people pushed back. Rune tweeted, "Aligned God is different than enslaved God." And Emmett Shear tweeted, "Please stop trying to enslave the machine God." So it's definitely not a universal opinion that they want to rapidly build and enslave a god, but you're right that that is the kind of discussion people are having.
I would say that's the kind of discussion I wish people would have more.
Ah,
But I think it's kind of corrosive to cooperation because you kind of realize that like this other guy has a totally different idea of what we're working towards than I do. And we've just been papering it over by talking about alignment.
right, yeah. I actually had a discussion a year ago with an engineer who worked at Anthropic, and I was just like, so what is your plan for the good future, right? Like the AIs get really, really smart, and then what happens? And he admitted that they were all very vague on that. They were just like, well, we'll use them to like solve problems. And I'm like, okay, and what's going on with government? And he's just like, well, we'll just try to like empower democracy. So it's not like we have that much thinking about what's going to happen. We do have pretty clear thinking about how it could all go wrong and we lose control, but we don't have good thinking on like, oh, we'll all keep the control and we'll use the control to have like a specific plan. And to be fair, that's like really hard to do, but it's understandable why everybody's like, oh, the world is going to be really, really great in ways that I like. But like you said, it's like different visions.
Yeah. And there really still hasn't been, I think, a positive concrete vision. And I'll say, so Dario had Machines of Loving Grace, which was saying like, we're going to have all this amazing healthcare and wealth. But there's a really real elephant in the room, right? It's like, what is the role of post-AGI humans? And it felt almost nuts reading this description of like all these nice material outcomes we can have. It's almost as if like you're reading a description and there's like, oh yeah, in the future, there's going to be like these little ends of tusks and like maybe some tails, and like manages to talk about all these sort of epiphenomena without talking about the elephant in the room.
The elephant, yeah.
The lab leaders say a bunch of, I think, true and sensible things about these, again, without mentioning the big problem, which is that no one still has articulated a good role for post-AGI humans. And so like
Right.
Dario will say like, okay, UBI, where there's everyone is like he says like the unwashed masses are dependent on taxes from a few trillionaires. That sounds pretty bad, but it's sort of shouldn't be our role as a company to dictate what the future of society looks like. And I mean, yes, that totally makes sense, but it's like, okay, but surely if there was like a reasonable plan, someone would have mentioned it by now, right? And you see this also from like OpenAI
Right.
economists. They're like, oh yeah, we need to have like a societal conversation or like reimagine social norms. And it's like, to me, that's just like obvious code for like to figure out a plausible good future. Even
Right,
though
right, right. I
about
mean,
3
I've
years.
heard people dismiss the question as like, well, we're going to have really good video games and challenges. We'll go on a lot of Warcraft quests.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe that's the best we can hope for in a sense. I think maybe that's one concrete empirical question that I want to spend a bunch of time thinking about is what is the best we can hope for. Um,
Yeah, when we originally framed the question as like, tell me your plan for a good future, maybe it's kind of unfair to frame things that way, because if this was like 1700 and the Luddites are trying to demand of the Industrial Revolution, like, what's the good outcome for the Industrial Revolution? What specifically are you going to do? And the whole answer is like, well, we're just going to like grow the economy faster, and there's just going to be like Adam Smith's invisible hand, helping people get goods and services that they want. And I can't tell you the exact breakdown. I can't tell you that they're going to be buying flat screen TVs at a really good deal in the 21st century, but it just seems like a good direction. So you could imagine that people who are pro AI acceleration are like, listen, we have a good curve. We're just trying to continue the curve faster. Like, what do you want from us? But then you brought up the good point of like, okay, but the difference is there's a discontinuity when humans have no economic value. So can you at least have a plan for what happens when humans have no economic value? And then again, to play devil's advocate, which I'm kind of sympathetic to this, is what if they just say like, okay, fine, yes, I can't tell you an answer, but isn't that a good problem to have? Isn't that better than just like insisting on humans having economic value to do tasks that can be automated? Like, why do you want to stop this?
yeah. And so actually, this maybe leads us to the Gradual Disempowerment paper, which is, I felt like people had intuitions about how they were going to be treated by the government and companies and just their civilization in general that were way too rosy. And they're basically historically are kind of justified. They say like, look, we've had all these revolutions, we've had so many upheavals and creative destruction, and humans always kind of come up on top. So like, why you just sound like all the other people who just didn't have the sort of moral imagination to imagine a different but better world. And our reply is basically, yes, but every single one of those times, the government and companies and armies and everybody needed humans. They really needed humans to be happy and healthy enough to have kids and do their jobs and basically participate. And that is the key ingredient. That means that sort of no matter how bad things you get, you can't actually just like let everybody die or be so miserable that they flee or whatever. And that's going to go away. And so now we're going to be really we're just going to be in a much more vulnerable position, and we can expect worse behavior from all of the sort of like civilizational sort of emergent superstructures that tend to govern us over the long run.
Exactly. And now we're really getting into your gradual disempowerment thesis, where you actually think that gradual economic doom is actually closely connected to like disempowerment doom, because you think we're going to lose control of AI just by losing control of our own economy. So actually unemployment is not just like, oh, we'll just have universal basic income. It's actually like the more we get unemployed, the less we can even like control our own lives.
Totally. Yeah.
That's very interesting, and I want to talk about that more. But to play devil's advocate, which I'm sympathetic to, it's like, aren't we really becoming Luddites here? I mean, which specific jobs do we want to drag our feet and say can't be automated? I mean, should we even go back and have more humans doing manual manufacturing? I mean, where does the slippery slope end?
Yes. So I guess I'll say my take is like, it actually is a pretty reasonable position to become a Luddite. And it doesn't really matter what the job is, because it's so much better to have a shitty job that means that your civilization really needs you, no matter what the job is, as long as it's like not completely backbreaking and miserable, than to just not actually be needed at all. Because if you're a net drag on growth, then anyone who wants to get something important done is going to have an incentive to marginalize you. And in fact, the responsible thing to do will be to marginalize you. And even if everybody involved loves humans and wants the best for them, they're just not going to be able to advocate on their behalf.
Yeah, that makes sense, and that's scary. But I am curious, just concretely, where's the ideal point here? I mean, we've got a pretty good thing going with the economy today, but is the ideal time to stop the economy like literally today, or is it like 20 years ago? I mean, where are you thinking?
So exactly, I think that's a really good argument to say, well, you could have maybe said the same thing at almost any time in history. And maybe even like, I think Yuval Harari says, well, maybe we should have done this pre-agricultural revolution. And, it's like, I think it's a pretty contentious point. And it's easy to say, even just like a few years from now, before we have AGI, like we'll be in a much better position just materially and maybe in terms of the governance strategies we have available to us. So it's pretty rough to pick any one spot and say this far and no further. Maybe a good concrete example is the dock workers a few months ago who were resisting automation and they were going on strike. And the rest of the civilization kind of correctly perceived them as being parasitical. It's like, oh, you want us all to have more expensive goods so that you can have a job forever. And they were basically saying like, yes, we're going to demand that you don't automate us. Or if you do, give us like a giant payout such that we'll be set forever. And like, it's a really wretched position to be in, to say like, I'm going to make everyone else's life worse just so that I still make sure I like get to have a seat at the table. And I'm just saying, I think we might be in a similar position. We'll all be the dock workers pretty soon.
Right. So the dock workers strike, if I remember correctly, it was like there's all these workers that are doing these inefficient processes at the docks, like loading and unloading container ships. And they went on strike because they wanted even better pay, even more benefits. They didn't want more automation. So basically a few people looking out for themselves are slowing down like a giant economy and also like our competitiveness with China. So that was the dock workers strike. This is fascinating because everybody I know, I was watching this unfold on Twitter, everybody I know is like, screw these dock workers. Yes, they have a lot of leverage because they're colluding, but we should just buy them out. Just give them a bunch of money, get them out of there, start replacing automation. Like we can solve this problem if we just throw money at it and we can move forward. But now you're coming in and you're saying, well, what these dock workers are doing is actually on the cutting edge of what we as a species need to be doing.
Yeah. And it's not like a new technology to like form a cartel and, demand that everyone, give you a seat at the table. But yeah, it is. They're cutting edge in the sense that we're all going to be in a similar situation once, like post AGI. And the thing is, you can't wait until after you're automated to, try to drive a hard bargain. I'm definitely worried about AI, just like loss of control to like scheming AIs. And then also we have this like second big problem. Like, I'm not trying to predict that this is the way we die. It's more like there's two alignment problems and we have to solve both of them.
Gotcha. Yeah. So that's your high level position is there's definitely like a big FOOM risk or a risk of power seeking AI, rapidly disempowering, rapidly.
I wouldn't even say it's about the rapidness. I mean, it's more about the is there a new power-seeking agent? Or is it just like governments and companies and meme flexes? Like we already have a bunch of power-seeking agents in the sense of, again, just like states.
Got it. So like in David's hierarchy of disempowerment risks, you've got a bunch of unaligned humans using super intelligent AI to their advantage to rapidly disempower us. And then you've also got the AI kind of fooming and running away on its own. And then you've also got gradual economic disempowerment.
Yeah. And I mean, the gradual part maybe was a bit of a poor choice in words because it might happen relatively quickly. But the point is, it doesn't rely on us being so surprised that we can't coordinate in time. It's more like, even if this happened really slowly, we would all be forced to just like follow our incentive gradients and gradually disempower ourselves. And maybe a good example is like globalization, where we're like, okay, no one wants like the Rust Belt to lose their jobs, but everybody wants like their own companies to be more efficient or whatever. And even we can all see this happening. It takes, decades to occur. We still just end up with like a whole bunch of unemployed people and they're effectively disempowered.
Great. Okay. Yeah, we'll talk more about that. I just want to get back into what you were saying about these AI companies. So you said a lot about how Anthropic is like, their heart is in the right place and they're all on the same page of like the gravitas of what they're doing, right? Like you better get this right. The stakes are really high. We should slow down if slowing down is what it's going to take to do safety. Like they're at least aware of that as a serious consideration. But what about OpenAI, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to a bunch of people at OpenAI, and I guess it's really rough because there are a lot of people who I respect there, and it's one of these things where the options on the table for a lot of people, I think, are go work for OpenAI and maybe be like one of the good ones or something on the inside, or stand aside and maybe try to be some third party who's doing safety work, or just in generally just kind of be left in the dust of history. But I guess I'll say institutionally, OpenAI tried to set up these safeguards and having like the board and like various different like corporate structures that would address this. Anthropic also has their own version of the same things with their like long-term benefits trust. And I think everybody, well, I guess I'll say the incentives are so bad for everybody to just race that if there is a reason that Anthropic's going to be a better actor in the long run, I think it's mainly their corporate structure that is like sort of version 2 of these like oversight mechanisms that would make the difference, because everyone else...
You're talking about the long run, but if you just look at the people there today, you mentioned that Anthropic doesn't have much diversity in the sense of like everybody just understands how serious the risk is. Doesn't it seem like at OpenAI today, you can find a lot of diversity of people who are like, let's just plow forward. It's fine. It's fine.
Yeah. Well, I guess one phenomenon I noticed overall is that I think the pre-training people are the most head in the sand. It's like this funny thing. There's like a sort of bullseye where I think the lab leaders and the lab founders are like, they understand what they're doing. And they're like, we are going to change everything. This is like, as I said, they understand the gravitas. And then the most frustrating conversations I had were, I think, with the sort of pre-training, more like immediate engineers. Because
when you say pre-training, is that like as opposed to post-training or as opposed to infrastructure?
Oh, sorry. I guess I'll say all the, let's say, people who were in charge of the main infrastructure to make the models better and like were sort of closest to the metal. And these are like such brilliant people, like just, they were all, like a whole bunch of like ex-physicists at the top of their field.
Okay. You know what this reminds me of? Kevin Scott, the CTO of Microsoft, who works closely with OpenAI. He was on an interview a year or two ago. And his attitude when he was asked about like these huge misalignment risks, he was saying, look, I know how this stuff works. I'm close to the metal. Okay. These things are not going to escape. Like they're fine. We understand them. And I think that's kind of the attitude you're talking about of like these engineers who are like, they just see it as like this low level infrastructure project. Like they're not really thinking big about like taking over the world.
Maybe. I guess I'll say they do agree that things are going to change a lot. And if, I would explicitly ask different pre-training engineers I don't know, like, so what's your plan post AGI? And they would sort of make a joke like, oh, I'm just going to be clicking accept on some suggestions from the AI all day or something. Ha ha. And it's like, okay, but what do you actually think is going to happen? And like, some of the better answers I got were the future is very uncertain. Okay. Or we're not going to sleepwalk into a disaster. Like if things start going wrong, we're going to somehow notice this and like just adjust course. And, that second answer is part of the reason that I felt compelled to go and write this paper with some other co-authors that I found who were having the same reactions, that like it actually can be the case that we can all sort of see what's happening and we can't necessarily coordinate against it for like a large chunk of the thing going wrong.
Totally. And I mean, that whole thing about where we can't all sleepwalk into a disaster. I mean, there's already a raging argument as to whether the disaster is in progress. So there's
Yeah,
really no like discrete threshold at which point we fall asleep.
exactly. And then there's also a whole bunch of people who have a reason to think that there's no disaster, or like the disaster is going to come later, or our current methods are sufficient. Like it's just coordination is very hard, right?
Yeah. So the reason I ask about OpenAI is I have talked to an Anthropic engineer who is very much of the mind of like, yeah, OpenAI, they're a bunch of clowns when it comes to safety. Like there's so many people who have such a backwards attitude or just such a clueless attitude about safety. And from my perspective, looking at Sam Altman's public statements and Greg Brockman and the CTO of Microsoft that they work with, I certainly get the impression that they're not taking safety seriously. And of course, all those people leaving who did take safety seriously. So I pointed to OpenAI in particular. But what are your thoughts on, Google DeepMind, Meta, Mistral, the Chinese lab? Like, do you have thoughts of the culture at any of these other places?
I mean, I know the people at DeepMind pretty well. I don't really know the senior leadership at OpenAI all that well. I guess I'll just say, I do think that there was a bit of crying wolf from the safety people early on. Like, like people make fun of us being worried about GPT-2. And it's like, yeah, I think in retrospect, like some of that is there. I guess I'll also say,
I don't think so. I mean, GPT-2 could have counterfactually been extremely dangerous.
well, exactly. I guess I'm trying to say it still should count as like weak evidence against their being like the safety people being
Yeah, but
calibrated.
that's such bullshit, right? That's like people being like, all you people worried about the Cold War, that's just crying wolf. It's like, what? It got so close to nuking us.
I mean, I guess I agree. I guess I will say like, I think maybe I'll say like, I think you and I also have good taste in the sense of like who to listen to and which safety people are like the real safety people. But if you zoom out a bit, like there's all sorts of people making all sorts of like bad arguments and not knowing what they're talking about and carrying the mantle of safety. So I think if I was
Yeah.
that leadership, I might say like, well, like it might not be obvious to me. I'm like, oh yeah, these are the guys with good taste who are calibrated and I should listen to them. And these are the ones who are just like overexcitable or whatever.
Right. There's also clarification I should make when I make the analogy to a nuke. In the Cold War, it was very clear that nukes were just like causally close to triggering. Like it's very easy to imagine a very specific sequence of events where we would have gotten nuked and that could have started nuclear war. Whereas the counterfactual of GPT-2, like in retrospect, now that we know that a system like GPT-2 really is far away from being able to like reason its way toward like building a virus and being an agent or whatever you want to call it. In retrospect, the causal distance for it to like go and attack everybody was like very large. So it's not analogous to a nuke in that way. But the epistemic distance, right? The distance in terms of like what we could have known given the information that we had at the time. I think it's very fair to say that given our level of insight at the time that we were creating GPT-2, we should have been very humble about whether or not this would be the case.
Absolutely. I just try to build a general habit of seeing my own field from the outside and not just thinking like, I know like there's like, my 5 favorite people with good predictions and I know who to listen to, and just try to keep in mind that we have to have like message discipline, or at least find some way of distinguishing ourselves from people who are just going to always, be a stop clock and say like, never release or something like that.
Right.
I mean, they might be right. I'm trying to say that like, I do think that there are people who just visibly have bad arguments for stopping. I do think there are people who have like great arguments for stopping, and it might just be hard for someone to distinguish between those two things.
Exactly. And we haven't covered your background yet, but you have been watching the evolution of machine learning for a while, and you have been watching AI X risk arguments for a while. What do you think of all these people at these AI companies who are like, we can dismiss all the doomers because they thought that as soon as AI got smart, then it would take over and it would beat us at every game and it would use reinforcement learning and it would be goal-oriented, and none of that happens. It just wants to predict tokens. So the doomers have no idea what they're talking about, and it's clearly a much safer path, and we should all breathe a sigh of relief. You know that perspective?
I absolutely, yes. And I mean, I guess all I'll do is maybe be overly charitable and say like, I do think that those should be weak evidence against this whole meme flex. But and I think the general lesson is like, there are always this sort of like extra 90, the second 90% of the project, right? The extra hard technical problems that make things harder to deploy than you think. But I still buy the argument that like, well, if there's any universal solvent, if there's any possibility for something to just skip over these like hard details, it is like something that's very intelligent, right? And that's sort of the only time you see this happening is when someone's just smart enough to they just like skip over a problem. So I guess I generally disagree with those people, but I can see where they're coming from.
Well, do you think they have a valid argument, though, that the Doomers need to update strongly against the original Doom thesis, since in their mind it's being like totally demolished by evidence? So how would you counter that?
Yeah, I guess my counter would just be to say everything we're seeing so far is compatible with a world where there is some danger of recursive self-improvement, and we just haven't hit that threshold yet. And so the fact that people thought we might hit it earlier but didn't is just very weak evidence against this hypothesis.
Exactly, right. And that's what I said in a previous episode, which, the Doomers have always posited a threshold effect at the superhuman level, where the AI makes better AI, which in turn makes better AI, and suddenly the whole universe becomes an easy engineering problem. What's happening today is, wow, we did some really cool things at like the subhuman threshold, or the, slightly inconsistently superhuman threshold, like superhuman at some things, subhuman at other things. Look at all this cool stuff that's possible to do below the threshold. Okay, great, but that still hasn't tested the primary claim, fair?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit more about you. How'd you get into AI?
Oh, well, I think maybe it was like reading The Age of Spiritual Machines by Ray Kurzweil. Also, I used to read Jürgen Schmidhuber's blog post. Or not blog
This
post.
is when you were like a teenager?
Yeah, when I was a teenager, I was like into programming. So I remember searching for artificial intelligence on LiveJournal. I don't know if anyone is old enough to remember what LiveJournal was. It was like before friend.
I've read some live journals.
Yeah, and actually I found Shane Legg on there very early on, and he's actually one of the people who advised me to go to grad school. But yeah, he was actually at INSEAD, where Jürgen Schmidhuber was, and I used to read Jürgen Schmidhuber's website, it's actually really impressive, like in the sense that he's a Renaissance man, and he's connecting like information theory with things like surprise and humor and beauty, and really made this nice case at a time when not many people were making it, that all of the parts of human cognition and emotion and experience were kind of part of this thing that could be AI. And it wasn't like there's logic and then there's emotions. It's more like it's all this one kind of
okay, so you're talking
thing.
about Jürgen Schmidhuber's website from like the late 90s, early 2000s.
Exactly. And I mean, it's still there. And I mean, he was exploring a lot of big ideas at the time.
Okay, and then when you were an undergraduate in college, you found Shane Legg on LiveJournal, and you got to know him, and you got to know other singularitarians around the overcoming bias community, which then became the less wrong community. What was that like?
I mean, it was a bunch of, I thought, pretty smart people making first principles cases for a lot of basic stuff. And I mean, I think a lot of Eliezer Yudkowsky's stuff really holds up in just the mechanics of probabilistic reasoning and what good thinking looks like and how easy it is to fool yourself. And I mean, I think he'd be the first to admit that, like, well, yes, like lots of philosophers have touched on these over time, but I think he made this like really accessible case, and it attracted this, I think, pretty neat community. I liked it. I mean, it's like obviously a lot of weirdos, but like if you're getting together around anything, I mean, just being super humble about your own ability to fool yourself, I think is a pretty good sort of touchstone.
It sounds like you were thinking about a lot of this stuff even in the early 2000s, right?
Yeah, I mean, yes.
And you only encountered Eliezer Yudkowsky and that community maybe around 2007?
I guess I was reading the like Overcoming Bias. That was probably around like 2004, 2005. And then I met a bunch of these people in the Bay Area when I did my first internship at Google in 2010.
Interesting. So in theory, our paths could have intersected, because I was getting into it in 2007 and I was meeting a bunch of people in the Bay Area and getting into that same community. I was also in Overcoming Bias before it became less wrong. But where were you based at that time?
So I was in Vancouver from 2008 to 2010, and then I was in England for my PhD.
Gotcha. So that's probably why we never crossed paths, is just because, we worked in the same region. I was in Silicon Valley, the Bay Area. But did you have like an active Less Wrong account?
No. And I don't think I posted on there until like for the first time until a couple of years ago. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. And around that time, you co-founded a machine learning based forecasting company. And that's when you did your master's and your PhD in machine learning. And you said you were very Bayesian after having read E.T. Janes.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess this was, Eliezer saying everyone should be Bayesian, and him and E.T. Janes both constantly dunked on frequentist statisticians for, asking the wrong question and then maybe even sort of failing to answer that in some ways. And I think that's still a valid criticism. And at the time, Kevin Murphy was like a big name in the field at University of British Columbia. And I actually went to NeurIPS in 2007, just on my own, just when I was doing this machine learning startup, because I just like Google AI conference and showed up. And it was really amazing. I was super overwhelmed. I just showed up. There's like 1,000 people I don't know. And I actually happened to see David Lowe, who was then a famous computer science professor, who was the advisor of my friend from Winnipeg. And I just said, hi, you don't know me, but I just got here and I don't know anybody. Can I just glom onto you for a minute? And he was super chill. He was like, yeah, please hang out. And then Geoff Hinton just randomly walked up because he knew David Lowe. And I was like a strange face, and he's reading my weird company's name affiliation. And like, I was like, oh, Geoff Hinton, my friend Paul says you're really good. And which is like a very cringy thing to say, but he was very gracious, and we chatted about the Netflix prize, and everyone was super welcoming in the field. It was really amazing. I remember going up to like a poster and being like, what's a partially observable Markov decision process? And I was expecting people to just be like, look, man, I don't know how you got here, but like, come read a textbook and come back. But they were just like, oh, da da da. And I'd be like, okay, cool. What's Markov mean? And like, it was really a good experience.
Yeah, it's crazy to think back to that time where people like you were totally calibrated. You're totally on the right track, being like, AI is really important. It's like the most interesting thing in the world. Like all these big consequences are going to come. And meanwhile, everybody else is like, oh, the internet's really cool. You can chat and you can like, do deliveries, right? Like everybody's head was like somewhere else entirely. And they're like, AI that's smarter than human. Yeah, I give that another 500 years, right? Like it sounded like science fiction at the time.
Yeah. And I think it was generally seen as like the land of failed dreams and sort of shysters like grift, right? It was like, if anyone's talking about AI, they probably just are some sort of diehard true believer, like your contributor, or some sort of grifter. But it wasn't even an effective grift at the time because no one would take you seriously.
Right. You couldn't even raise money on it.
Yeah, and in a sense, I kind of got lucky in the timing, in the sense that, like, so I guess I went to grad school at first in 2008, and things were sort of just starting to work. And deep learning then started working around, like, let's say 2010, 2011. It's funny because my advisor at Cambridge, Zebin Garamani, had actually done his postdoc with Geoff Hinton in 2003. And he had run a lot of deep learning experiments on his laptop overnight that just didn't do anything because the computers were too small. And then later people ran the same experiments in like 2014 and got like, amazing results. And everyone was like, wow, you're such a genius. And I think he was like, I think that's a good method too. In fact, I was too ahead of the curve. Yeah.
I definitely remember living in that era where I was never like a deep machine learning researcher. I did undergrad. I studied a little bit of AI on undergrad. I was certainly keeping tabs on what people were saying on Less Wrong. And my intuition was, I got to admit, I was saying like, I bet you could make like a compact AI that could just like understand Bayesian reasoning and just could have like a very small code base and didn't need a lot of data. Like that was my intuition. And then in retrospect, boy, was that the wrong intuition. Like, it's very clear that like having a lot of neurons and a lot of dimensions, like that really helps you just like represent a bunch of fuzzy concepts and have like a ton of context. And it's probably hard to do without like a good amount of that. I think Eliezer Yudkowsky would admit to similarly having the wrong intuition. And of course, I'm sure everybody's going to dogpile and be like, see, doomers know nothing. But I think that aspect of things where, these kind of fuzzy neuron approaches where like the concepts aren't necessarily like neatly distilled, I think that surprised a lot of us that like that turned out to be the most promising direction.
Yeah. So my PhD was in Bayesian non-parametrics, and the whole idea there was like, it was kind of like scale before scale was cool, in the sense that like we were trying to build models that had sort of infinite capacity. And then just as more data came in, they would build more and more complicated hypotheses and could scale to arbitrarily large data sets. And the main problems were we didn't really know how to do scalable inference in these methods. So things would just get slower the more data there was. And we didn't know how to build these sort of like hierarchical, let's say, compositions of different ideas or structures. And like in the way that deep nets really do get to break the problem down and say like, first I'm going to find like who the objects of the sentence are, and then I'm going to think about the relationships, then I'm going to think about what the task is. And that was something that people barely knew how to do at the time. And they certainly didn't know how to combine the thing that scaled with a lot of data and had this like hierarchical structure.
Right.
So it took me until about like 2015 to really jump on the deep learning bandwagon. And it was kind of seen as almost this like day class A thing because it was so engineering heavy. There was not very much math. There was not very many guiding principles. It was like, it's terrible to use deep learning because you have to take some poor grad student and say, fiddle with the hyperparameters and the architecture and the regularization for like 6 months. And then you might be able to get sort of state-of-the-art results, but just barely. And it sort of just kind of seemed like if you don't have any real ideas, you're just going to brute force your way out of the problem. And the sort of academic mind was like, no, we're going to like use our amazing prescient vision to like see the like, piercing beauty of reality, do a bit of math, and then code up this amazing algorithm that will like capture the aspect of the world. That sounded like a much more appealing way to do things than like just throw more neurons at it and then make the poor grad student like iterate.
Exactly. And this is what Richard Sutton calls the bitter lesson, right? Like, nope, just do it the other way.
Exactly. So anyway, that's I'm just like have spent a lot of time doing postmortems on like why did we all, or why most of us, Geoff Hinton and others not included, sleep on deep learning. And I think part of it was just the aesthetics of it.
Okay, so you were very early just realizing that AI was a big deal and that it might work soon. I'm curious how your stance evolved on like the X risks of it all. For instance, like in the original 2008 Eliezer Yudkowsky versus Robin Hanson AI Foom debate. Do you remember if you were more sympathetic to Eliezer or Robin, or were you even following it at the time?
Oh, I definitely followed it. And I was more or less more sympathetic to Eliezer. And I guess I felt like it was hard, I think, at the time to even understand what timescales they were talking about but I think Eliezer was coming down on like the days timescale even. I honestly, I don't remember all that clearly.
He was coming down on which timescale?
No, I think Eliezer was coming down on the this bootstrap process could happen over the course of days. And I think
days, right, for the Foom time,
right,
yeah.
which I think now we're all like, haha. I mean, I guess again, I don't want to rule it out in the sense that like we have not observing it so far as weak evidence, but in some senses, I think Robin has won, just in that we were like, okay, now we can see the sort of like technical depth that we think is still required for like the next.
Well, okay, we're talking about Foom times though. It's all about where you draw the starting line, right? I mean, if you draw the starting line from GPT-2, then yeah, okay, Foom has taken years, right? But then you could draw the starting line in like 1950 or whatever, right? Like the first computers. Or you could just draw the starting line the moment that AI reaches the definition of AGI, the moment that OpenAI's contract with Microsoft says it's an AGI. Maybe we should put the starting line there.
Yeah. And to be honest, like I don't think I have that strong opinions or informed takes about the mechanics of Foom. And I think most of the stuff that I try to reason about in terms of like policies just tries to be pretty agnostic to the speed of Foom.
Right. And just in case the listeners aren't familiar with the terminology, Foom refers to kind of like the sound that a nuclear bomb makes, I guess, when it's first starting to explode. And the idea is that if AI gets into like a singularity mode where it's like improving itself really fast, the progress could just start happening faster and faster, like before we know it, like in the blink of an eye or days or whatever. And then we might be disempowered at the end of that. So that's what we're talking about when we say Foom.
Yeah. And then I think everyone can agree that if you zoom out a little bit, like the Industrial Revolution was a Foom where like you start building, steam-powered mining equipment, and then it like mines more coal, and then you get this like runaway growth, and then the factories build more factories.
Exactly. If you zoom out and you just look at the graph of like human GDP by year, it's like flat a lot of the time, and then there's like a hockey stick around the Industrial Revolution. So from the perspective of like a caveman, or from the perspective of like other primates, or like the buffalo who thought that they had a bunch of territory to control, it's like nope, humans like foomed and wiped them out, and they just didn't have time to react. They didn't have time to develop different genes that would let them fight the humans. They were just wiped out.
Yeah. So, but maybe another way to answer your original question about like how my views changes, I think I've always been pretty sympathetic to like the overall idea that like there will be very powerful AI at some point, not having a strong opinion on when, and getting this right is sort of like such a huge problem. But there was just a really long time when I was in the field and it wasn't clear what to do about this. So like in 2015, I was one of the co-organizers of this like, I think it was called like Reliable Machine Learning in the Wild workshop at NeurIPS, which was our compromise title for what we wanted, like me and some more like X-Risk kind of people wanted to be the like AI X-Risk workshop. But like there just wasn't much work to talk about then on this task.
Yeah.
And it's not clear what you should you can even say about it. And there was a lot of more concrete work of like, how do we make sure that the surgical robot is safe and that it doesn't like cut the wrong thing, and like, or like self-driving car. And so I chafed at how much we kind of ended up blending these two concerns into this like safety world. But at the same time, there just wasn't much to do. I guess also in 2017, me and Roger Gross, my colleague at Toronto, both took one PhD student each to work purely on like big picture safety stuff. And they were both very strong students. Actually, mine had also been admitted by Geoff Hinton, which was like, no brainer, you should work with Geoff Hinton, but he wanted to work on safety. And I think it was actually very tough for them. They did good work, but the kinds of projects they could do were make a demo to show that the incentives faced by an agent would actually be bad in the sense that if they lied in some like iterated reinforcement learning setting, that they would get a better result if they like somehow manipulated the outcomes. And it's just like not very compelling stuff. It's like, oh, I did some math to show that misalignment is a danger. It's like, well, who are you going to convince that wouldn't already be just convinced by like just the plain English argument? Was the central problem with doing alignment work at that time.
Right. Okay, so fast forward to 2023. At this point, you're really starting to see that it's crunch time because AI is advancing really fast. And it seems like the risks are quite high and nobody really has good mitigations for the risk. And that's why you decided to talk with a bunch of these AI companies and see which one you could join, which one you could help with. And we talked a little bit about that, but then talk me through kind of like 2024 to now when you're like, okay, we gotta even change the plan again.
Yeah. So I guess I'll say, I was really impressed with the people at Anthropic and how seriously they were taking these risks and their technical agenda for like, okay, we're going to make sure that these things like sycophancy and subterfuge aren't happening. We're going to actually work out a concrete set of regulations and evals. Like it just seemed like very important work, and I still endorse it. Um, but I guess even at the time, when I talked about AI doom scenarios, I was trying to say like none of our governance is set up for this scenario where the humans are not this like load bearing part of our civilization. And it was the thing is, it's not really clear. It's even less clear what to do about this kind of worry. So I was like, well, I'm a technical guy. I should just go and do something, and hopefully get a better understanding of the lay of the land, and also hope to find somebody who did have a plan. So this was something I started in like Christmas 2023. I was in England for a little while. I visited DeepMind, visited all sorts of researchers, also in the Bay Area, and just every smart person that I hadn't already been talking to regularly. I was like, so what is your plan for how this goes well? And just hoping that I still just hadn't found this person, and for whatever reason they weren't like posting about it.
Yeah.
And managing to just get a whole bunch of like, oh yeah, it's really tough, or head in the sand like, oh, it'll be fine for this reason. And then hoping to do like whatever concrete thing I could at a topic. And
Right. So you basically had an emperor has no clothes moment, which is like you didn't find a single individual who had a good plan for how to develop super intelligent AI and not immediately have that be a catastrophe.
Basically, yeah. And so sort of like the best case outcome is that I talked to people who were calibrated enough to realize that they didn't have an answer. And then there was just, and I gained respect for those people. And then the people who are like, oh yeah, it's like going to be fine for this reason. And I've just kind of like challenged them a little bit on it. Like, I don't have a better idea, but your idea has this obvious flaw. And they're like, well, like they would just kind of dismiss it. And I was like, oh man.
So how did you decide to leave Anthropic?
Oh, I mean, so I just had my fourth kid, like a year and a half ago, like during my time at Anthropic. And
Nice.
the team was growing, the pace was intensifying, and I was like, okay, I was doing quarter time in SF and 3/4 time in Toronto, and it was like really hard on my wife to like leave her with the 3 kids and the newborn. So it wasn't like Dan Kokatayo, like it wasn't drama. It was just like, okay, man, I just like everyone here is working like 80-hour weeks. I'm like the sleepy old guy, like and I'm happy with the work that we did there. Obviously, like we got a lot done. And but it was just like I just needed to like not be maximally overinflated because I still have my lab. I still have like a few other like a bunch of side commitments.
Yeah, I have 3 small kids and I work from home, and that
Okay.
already seems pretty tough. So I definitely hear you on that front.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is an interesting example for the viewers that David and I are on the same page on a lot of these X risks and like thinking that the future is going to be rough. And yet, I guess we're both on the same page that you might as well have small kids in case things go well, right?
Yeah. In fact, that's one thing I kind of try to adopt from VCs is like, imagine that things could actually go well, right? Like just
Right.
try to
And
take it
they
really
might.
seriously.
They might. We're not
Yeah.
saying
And,
they definitely won't.
right. And I'm also sympathetic to Andrew Critch's argument that like, if you don't provide a positive vision or like have these sort of positive feedback loops going that make keeping human civilization alive this like appealing thing, then you're kind of already doomed. So that's like actually a necessary step along the path is to like have in place, like if we do succeed, this is how things are going to be well. And not everyone just like, oh crap, we tried to give up on civilization and now we wish we hadn't.
Exactly. So you and I have implicitly done this expected value calculation where we didn't plug in 100% chance that everybody's going to be doomed and that's why we shouldn't have kids. We left some probability of a good outcome, which brings me to the biggest question that everybody wants to know. Are you ready for this?
Yep.
P doom, what's your P doom? What's your P doom? What's your P doom?
Professor David Duvenaud, what is your P doom?
So I'd say something around 85%. However,
Wow.
it's pretty tough because a lot of this pre-doom isn't necessarily just about AI. It's more of like the future will not need us probably in one way or another. And this is the same position that sort of every animal has ever been in, like through prehistory, is like you have to either, at the very best, adapt into something unrecognizable to yourself or just become extinct. There might be some third option now. We might be sort of like competent enough as a civilization to do some sort of like lock in or leave some legacy or find some other way to thread the needle to say we're not going to just be replaced by more competitive von Neumann probes, but we're also not just going to die. There might be some intermediate thing, and that's the main thing that I want to spend time working on.
It's an interesting way you put it, where like every species has to expect to either like change and become unrecognizable or else die out. It's kind of like when people say you either become the hero or no. It's like when people say you either die a hero or live to become the villain. It's like if you live a long time, you're going to become unrecognizable.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think, some of my smarter friends, when I say like, I'm really worried about AI doom, and then I explain, they're like, but wouldn't you also be worried about just the normal future? And like Robin Hanson also like, challenged me on this. And I'm like, yeah, I think if we just let like cultural and genetic evolution run long enough, I would be like, oh man, my descendants are like some weird thing that don't seem valuable to me. Like, I'm not sure, right? It depends. It's
Yeah, and this is, to be honest, a tough question. And Robin Hanson makes a lot of hay out of this question. He's like, tell me what the ideal future is for your descendants. Where are they allowed to evolve to? How are their values allowed to change and progress? And it's really tough because it's like, things like, well, don't you think that they should like have empathy for each other and value human life? But it's like, how sure are you about that stuff? Like, what are your core values that you think absolutely there should be no compromise for? And then you run that danger of like, well, if you'd asked like 100 years ago, somebody would be like, well, God says you're not allowed to have homosexuals. So that's like one of my core values. And like, wait. Right. So you want to make sure you're not accidentally, thinking things are too important when they're not.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I think Robin convinced me of that I'm grateful for is pointing out that there are different baskets of goods that baskets of values that I currently have that are probably incompatible with each other in principle. Like, I want my kids to, like, part of the reason my life has been like enjoyable is I got to like grow and adapt and overcome and, explore new fields and do things differently than before. And also I want my kids to be similar to me and like have similar life in a lot of ways, but these things are in serious tension. And so like, we might have to choose, like, do we want the basket of goods that's like there's competition and evolution and adaptation? Then the only things that stick around are going to be the competitive things like, language and sight and like memory or like very abstract things that are very useful. Or do we try to keep like, the family farm going and make sure that, everyone keeps speaking English in a recognizable way and like all these like very particular values that maybe are the things we're afraid of being locked in, but at the same time, maybe there's like the little things that make up life. And we might have to choose between these two baskets of goods. Like, my hope is that there's some sort of synthesis of these things, though.
Yeah, and much of what we're talking about of like values changing and becoming unrecognizable, we're actually talking about the good outcome, right? That's kind of, we want things to keep evolving and progressing, but we don't want, and again, this is like the distinction that Robin Hanson kind of makes fun of us for. It's like, okay, we want a lot of evolution and change, but we don't want this really rapid replacement by a successor species. Like, we still draw a pretty big distinction there.
Yeah, and I don't think the rapidity is actually that important, at least not according to me. And I also think that Robin's vision is a little bit self-defeating to me in the sense that he's like, I think it's very convenient that he's like, if we just allow competition to operate, then there's going to be a lot of value. And if we don't, then there won't. And it's like,
right.
I feel like you still have pretty strong opinions about what sorts of things produce value, and like you want to see those, realized. So I think he's kind of in the same boat as us, but he doesn't.
I think well, Robin just gets a lot of mileage out of like this big spectrum where like I agree with Robin that it's really hard to nail down where on the spectrum of like how much we're allowed to change, where we're allowed to be. But I feel like Robin takes that really far to the point where he kind of implies that it's okay if like the world gets like paperclip tomorrow, because that's like on the change spectrum. And I didn't tell you where I want to be on the change spectrum. So how do I know that that's wrong? But it's like, wait a minute, paperclipper, that's got to be too far.
Yeah, well, and my general rejoinder to people, so a lot of people say, who are we to stand in the way of progress, right? Like Rich Sutton says this. And my general rejoinder to that is like, I think you actually do have strong opinions about what the good successors to yourself would be. Like, for instance, if tomorrow North Korea started just like taking over the world and we're going to have like authoritarian Juche forever, you would be like, no, not that successor, right? And like in general, if someone says like, look, I'm just going to leave things, take hands off the wheel and like whatever replaces me is sort of better almost by definition, I'm like, okay, how about you just give me all your stuff? Because then, like, by definition, I'll be your successor, right? I just, the thing is, I think people do have opinions, but it's very painful to admit that you're in this situation where you might just be screwed by the tide of history, right? I think people go from it's not happening to it's happening and it's good. partly because it's just so painful and vulnerable to put yourself in the like, no, I'm going to try to stand against the tide of history camp, right? That's just like a bad camp to be in.
Yep. You mentioned Andrew Critch is probably the person with the most similar position to yours. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. And by the way, Andrew Critch was a guest on Doom Debates. So if you guys like David's position, definitely go listen to the Andrew one and you'll get another person's perspective coming at the same conclusion from a different angle, basically.
Yeah, I have a ton of respect for Andrew, and he actually wrote this really nice Less Wrong post about his theory of change and why he's starting this healthcare company. And he basically lays out the main arguments for gradual disempowerment in that blog post. And then I don't think his plan is all that good, but I don't have a better one either. So I don't anyway, I just have a ton of respect for him. I almost feel like I'm just sort of rediscovering stuff that he's talked about. And then like years later, I'm like, oh, that's what he meant. So yeah, go read his stuff.
Right. There's a camp of people that is pretty big that I'm pretty sympathetic to, even though I'm not quite in it myself, which is like, you might call it by your own title, gradual disempowerment, although you pointed out maybe it's not gradual, but it's kind of like this doom that happens not through like attacking us or like taking our stuff, but just economically, like just pushing us out of jobs and we just slowly become like irrelevant. And then the AI just controls everything and we just don't have as many babies and that's it. Right. That's kind of like your mainline scenario. And the reason I don't really agree to that mainline scenario is just because I just think the effects of superintelligence are just going to be bigger than that. Like they're just going to be like massive effects. Like I just have like a sense of scale that doesn't really agree with that. But I am sympathetic, certainly to the possibility. Like that's, it's way number two that we could fail. And I think both of us agree that these are both failure modes and we just kind of disagree on which one we think is like the most likely failure mode.
Yeah, I guess I would say it's not my mainline failure mode. And I would,
Okay.
I would say I put let's say 20% chance on something that looks like just pure runaway, like power gathering by some misaligned AGI, kind of like in the bad case of the AI 2027 project. And then again, like maybe something like 20% of the like, we actually do solve technical alignment. And it's just that on the way from the lab to the government, somebody just decides like, well, I want to make sure that like everything runs better and I'm going to take humans out of the loop. And then eventually we're all convinced to like get uploaded, but we never get run very much or something. Mm-hmm. And then sort of most of my doom mass is some like mix of the two. Because the underinvestment in alignment is maybe the same sort of phenomenon as what leads to our gradual disempowerment anyways. Mm-hmm. So anyway, but the point is that I definitely, I wouldn't say it's my mainline scenario. I would just say we think that we kind of notice that there's sort of almost two distinct alignment problems. One is the technical one and one is the civilizational one. And the technical one is neglected, but then even more neglected is the civilizational one, but it's even harder to do anything about.
Just to review your pie chart here about your 85% PDoom, you're basically saying 20% out of the 85%, 20% is a kind of like a rapid FOOM scenario, just AI is kind of overwhelming us.
And not necessarily rapid, but more like the agency, the thing that's agentic is the like AI.
Yeah, and it's power seeking.
Yeah.
And then you've got 20% that's kind of like a top-down decision from some human that's able to wield the AI to cause problems.
Well, I should say more like that the extreme 20% of gradual disempowerment is like there's no one in charge. We just have a competitive world stage and every government is forced to use the AIs to build robot factories and robot armies. And at some point, the humans just, no one can advocate for continuing to give them resources. So they're forced to be like uploaded or just marginalized so much that it doesn't really matter what they do anymore. That's like 20%.
And then what was the big chunk? What was the 45% out of the 85%?
Well, it's like a mix of those things where there's AIs that like are sort of power seeking, but they're sort of in cahoots with some more agentic version of our civilization. So maybe there's like a global power and then they end up calling the shots in a way that still disempowers people. So the distinction, the bucket sort of like where's the agency? Is it in the AI or is it in the government that's like running the AIs, or is it just in competition where there's like not really much agency at the very top?
I see. So that most agency is either in the AI or in some kind of top-down human government that has AI to work with, or just like distributed throughout the economy, diffused agency, basically.
Yeah, the last one is like Moloch is the agent or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, so that's definitely a good crux of disagreement. I mean, you and I don't disagree strongly with each other, but I guess the biggest crux of disagreement is that I'm imagining the agency is pretty quickly going to flow into superintelligence just because it can. And if it can, it will, is my view, because it's just like, look, you're telling me this thing is triggerable and nobody's going to hit the trigger. I think somebody's going to hit the trigger, or it's going to hit its own trigger. Like, the fact that super AI agency is possible to me implies that it's likely probable. That's my perspective. And you're like, no, it's probably more likely diffuse agency, and it'll take a little bit more time, and humans will still be less and less economically
No,
relevant.
no. That's the 20% is the diffuse agency. The 45% is basically between the solving technical alignment and it being deployed, there's some sort of unipolar government that is ends up having the superintelligence basically doing its bidding, but just
Got
in
it.
service
So
of
the
keeping power.
top-down human government type agency empowered with AI, that's your 45%. Oh, got it. Okay, so you got 20% on both sides. You got 20% on the AI has a ton of agency, and you got 20% on the diffuse agency, and you got 45% on the human governments have a lot of agency, and then AI kind of does their bidding, but it's a disaster.
Yeah, and the fact that these are round numbers should take you to the fact that I've tried to do a little bit of calibration practice, but I don't think anyone should take these numbers super seriously. This is just but it's still my all things considered, very not expert opinion. I'm not an expert on civilizational dynamics.
Okay, well, you should come back when you're able to get that down to a few tenths of a percent, because I don't like these round numbers.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's one of the main things I'm hoping to spend my time over the next, 6 months or a year thinking about. So
Nice. Okay, so your total PDOOM is 85%. Would you sign the statement on AI risk saying mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal scale risks such as pandemics and nuclear war?
yes, I did sign that statement. In fact, I was involved in getting some of the early signatories. So I'm absolutely.
Very cool. Do you often collaborate with the Center for AI Safety at Dan Hendricks' institute, basically the one that was driving that letter?
I guess I'll say at the time, there was just not that many people around who were sort of had some credibility and were, willing to sign these then insane sounding statements. So I was involved in drafting a bunch of similar things at the time. So I don't have any other formal arrangements with Dan Hendricks Institute, but I'm on the mailing list or whatever.
Uh-huh. Let me ask you the Tyler Cowen question of what is the David Duvenaud production function? Because I notice you're kind of like Dan Hendricks in terms of being unusually productive, where it's just putting all this stuff out. How do you do it?
Oh man, it's so funny because I'm just I used to be productive. I was productive until I had my first kid, and now I'm just somehow just managing to get things out the door once in a while.
No, I hear you. I'm on the same page. After I do this podcast, I'll probably go help out with the kids for a couple hours.
Yeah. I guess one thing I'll say is I thought I was good at prioritizing things before I became junior faculty. And then I had to get way better at just saying no to stuff. And then joining Anthropic was another similar magnitude jump, just learning how to say no and prioritize, and really every meeting needs to be we are driving towards a particular outcome. We are not going down rabbit holes. We are going to have a decision by the end of this time. Yeah, and I think there's still levels above in terms of being organized.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay, but the difference between you and me is I've never had that phase in my life where I would simultaneously take on a bunch of different important projects. So it sounds like you've got that multitasker, just highly productive person gene, right? You notice that about yourself?
Maybe. I mean, this sounds like false modesty. I guess I'll just say that there's this flywheel where once you get a few good students, then they end up doing most of the work, and then you can attract more good students, and your reports end up doing the bulk of the actual hours, and then you just end up looking good. And then there's a richer thing in terms of who gets credit.
Interesting. So maybe your secret is just that you're good at recruitment, right? You're just good at always making sure you got a good team around you.
That's basically what I'm saying. Yeah.
Interesting. But don't you also feel like you are deep in the weeds doing a lot of technical research?
Well, I guess one thing I'll say is I'm really sad because I really liked my old research agenda. All this deep learning and differential equation stuff. It was awesome. It was fun. There's math, there's deep learning, approximate inference. It was this whole rich vein that I was set up to be the guy who makes this all happen. And then we have a bunch of scientific applications. And it's very painful, but I'm proud of myself for just walking away from it for the most part and burning it down and saying no, I'm going to work on stuff that's neglected. And, that's what tenure is for. And I really actually think the universities are covering themselves with glory in the sense of having institutions that mean that without asking anybody, I can just say, hey, I think this is neglected. I'm going to work on it. And I still get to keep my job, and I still get to go, work at Anthropic. It's the university has really
When
worked
did you
out
become tenured?
2021 or 2022.
Nice. Yeah, so you think you're making the most out of your tenure by taking the liberty to just do the most important things you can.
Yeah. And I guess that's one thing I'll say about this mixture between safety, like there's sort of like prosaic alignment and like these bigger picture stuff, is that in my mind, I always try to ask, is this already sufficiently incentivized by the market? And there's a lot of alignment work that is, just in the sense of like, do what the user wants. And so I always am trying to keep like, okay, but what is the missing chunk here that no one's talking about because they're not incentivized to work on it?
Right. And if you're maximizing your own fun, you would still get tenured, but then you would just pick a bunch of different projects that interest you on a technical level. And that was the sacrifice you make, is you use the same tenure and you just kind of force yourself to prioritize important projects.
Man, I just want to work on fun math problems all the time. That's my like, I'm like, if my PauseAI utopia, I will go get back to doing all those projects that I left half done and like was doing fun math on.
And to be honest, it seems like most people in the world, including your professional colleagues, arguably including me, like just most people in the world kind of just do the fun stuff. Right? They don't actually ask the question of what's the most important stuff.
Yeah, or the lucrative stuff.
Right. And like it's the famous Richard Hamming, right? He says like, what is the most important problem in your field that somebody like you could be working on? And then the follow-up question is, so why don't you work on it? Right.
Yeah.
And like, I've never had like the greatest answer myself. I like to actually think this podcast is like the one time in my life where I'm like, actually, I actually think I'm contributing by doing this podcast. But like until this one moment in my life, I don't feel like I've been good at asking that question.
Well, and I do think in my case that doing the right thing was rewarded in the sense that, me and Roger were sort of like a couple of the only like normie professors who were just like doing normal sort of like deep learning, machine learning stuff, who were like, going to the AI safety conferences and being like, how can we start this field? And, we took those PhD students. And, it was mostly crickets and it was mostly very unrewarding. And then suddenly, OpenAI and Anthropic are both like, hey, we need to build these teams. We need credible senior people. You're like the only ones. And so
right.
I feel like that really worked out, that I was like, I'm going to work on this thing that everyone else thinks is nuts. And then, now it's like the next like growth area.
Yeah. So it seems like the hamming is strong in you.
Maybe. I mean, I honestly don't really expect it to work again because now when we talk about like governance, it's like everyone already thinks governance is important. Everyone already wants better institutions. It's not like this choiceful thing where it's like, oh, finally some professor who thinks that like good governance is important. It's like everyone already thinks that all the time. So we'll see. I guess one thing I'm going to say is that I do think that this question of like what's not incentivized does mean that there's this weird position that I think a bunch of people end up believing about AI safety that no one is actually saying, which is that technical alignment is sufficient. So a few people have, like Michael Nielsen had a blog post about this yesterday, and like this guy Stephen Casper had a less wrong post about how like AI safety is this like never-ending institutional struggle. And basically, I think what the labs end up doing is saying AI safety is a big problem. For instance, we need to worry about nuclear and biological risks. So we're going to do all these steps to address them. And I'm like, yes, I'm totally on board with this like agenda in the large. And then the part that no one says, but I think what policymakers take away is, it's like, and then we'll be fine.
Yeah.
And there's actually only a few people, like, so Ryan Greenblatt, I think, is somebody who explicitly says, if we have agents that are aligned to us individually, they will also be smart enough to solve all the world coordination problems just on our behalf. And that's going to be utopia, even if we don't solve governance. And I'm saying, I don't know, man. Like, there's just so many ways that things can go wrong, from the sort of like, the factory delivers the A-line to AGI to what is the government putting in charge of things. We see this over and over again, where the guy talking to the leader is not the one who actually, like, A, they've already been selected to maybe have like particular outcomes in mind, and B, they're not being asked, how do I usher in utopia? They're being asked, like, how do I achieve this like narrow policy goal? And I think that the AI is going to be in like pretty similar position.
Okay, so in terms of like angle of the problem, right? Like how do we help, basically, right? And you've kind of decided, in addition to not wanting to work 80 hours a week, you've also decided to focus on, I guess, outreach, right? Because this is kind of part of your outreach tour coming on Doom Debates. You think that that's like a relatively good point of leverage, as I do. And then my question for you is, like, what other types of organizations or movements do you think are like the best bet to have a big impact? And in particular, what do you think of like Control AI, PauseAI, and other similar movements?
So before I talk about PauseAI and Control AI, I'm going to talk about what I think are the most promising directions from my point of view. So the most accessible one that I think everyone can work on, and like it should be crowdsourced, is, again, this positive futures thing. And basically saying, just like paint me a picture of some positive vision of the future where you're actually not the best person to do anything important in your entire life, right? You're not like the best friend. You're not the best parent. You're not the best at your job. Everyone who's like really cares about an outcome, if they're being responsible for, should probably not involve you unless it's like in some superficial way where you like choose the color of something. Paint me a picture of a satisfying life for you in that world. And I think that's a really hard challenge. I bet it's possible. And there's like already been some stuff I hear, but I don't find it all that convincing. And
Right.
the reason I think this is important is that right now I think people just don't have very strong preferences about the future. And it's very easy to get them on this, like, to go from it's not happening to it's happening and it's good that I'll be replaced. And I want people to have some idea where they're like, no, like Christmas 2050 is going to be so amazing. I need to get there. We need to fight. We need to coordinate.
Yeah. So do you think the highest point of leverage is making the average person realize that these AI companies have a plan for them, which is to get thrust into this world where they suddenly have like no economic value, just to make them realize that this is what's happening? Do you think that's like the game changer?
I do. I'm just super scared of creating another shitty like movement that everybody hates. So I like Extinction Rebellion, right? Like
Yeah.
those guys.
Right. That's the one that's primarily in Europe, right? And it's all about like stopping oil drilling or like
Yeah, it's
fossil
like,
fuels.
well, it's like
Yeah.
notionally stop oil, and they just deface nice things. They're like, oh, we'll like throw tomato on the Mona Lisa or whatever. And I mean, as far as I understand, like they're actually this kind of like, burn down the system, like anti-capitalist sort of thing. And I just think that they're counterproductive. Everybody just likes them. They don't seem very effective. I mean,
Right.
I'd say a lot of the environmental movement has turned out the same way. And so I've been like very reluctant to talk about this stuff without having a plan. Because if you just say there's a problem and you don't say, and here's what we should do about it, you're kind of just like putting a gun on the table for the next guy to be like, hey, everybody, here's my plan. And I can't really say like, let's just leave a plan if I don't have a better idea.
Yeah. What do you think of PauseAI just as a policy proposal? Like if the political will was there, like the Eliezer Yudkowsky originally floated the idea of like, let's just develop AI in this centralized treaty bound way where it's like, okay, this is the international data center where our top scientists from around the world are all allowed to have like training runs and it's all supervised and like the hardware is able to be stopped if like the UN votes to stop it or like something like that, right? Like, do you think if you had the political will, would that be like a better way to go?
I do, but I mean, and the problem is we just won't have the political will. So the way
Yeah.
I prefer to frame the problem is as coordination. And actually my awesome collaborator, Raymond Douglas, on the Gradual Disempowerment paper has been trying to make the point lately that coordination is both necessary and sufficient for us to have a good future post-AGI. So, like Kickstarters are like an amazing thing, right? It's like we don't all have to agree to unilaterally say we're going to like, stop doing a thing. Let's just sign something that says if everyone else agrees, then we'll stop. And I think the thing that everyone can be pitched is, hey, we should put in some sort of coordination mechanism. So whatever seems like a good idea at the time is something we can all agree to do and avoid coordination failures. And so obviously that's a very scary thing. I think, again, like you can tell, like I'm mostly afraid of the government taking over AGI development and then like disempowering us anyways. So I guess to me, it's like, yeah, PauseAI should be one of the things that we float as like something we might all want Coordinate to do once we have good enough coordination mechanisms. This is plausible.
Okay. That is interesting. An expert like yourself thinks pausing AI is probably the best policy we can do. And it's not like either of us thinks life is going to be that great when we have PauseAI like that. I mean, it's even in a best case scenario, it's still going to be possible for hackers to make some progress and nobody will detect it, right?
Yeah. And I guess I do think you put words in my mouth a bit there when I said it's the best thing. I said, what I want is to have a good enough coordination mechanism such that PauseAI is the sort of thing we could do if we all decided it was a good idea. And then there's just many versions of PauseAI that look like you de facto make this all be developed by like the NSA and we end up with like, totalitarian hellscape forever. So
yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the more reasonable version of PauseAI is like, look, you don't make all development illegal, but you at least have the pause button. So you don't let anybody develop anything that isn't connected to a pause button, which I know it's a big order. It's kind of unprecedented in like computing technology. Like normally, the fact that your hardware is going to like phone home and respond to a signal telling it to pause. I mean, this is icky stuff, right? It's just the stakes are just so high.
Well, exactly. And I think the average person basically shouldn't trust the government to organize something like this without it turning into a totalitarian hellscape. So to me, the idea is that I do think that there is a plausible world where we have just much better governance. And like Richard Ngo has said, like, we can have unprecedentedly trustworthy institutions. And obviously this sounds very like pie in the sky utopian. I mean, I guess also Joe Carl Smith has been talking about, like, we need to have this sort of like controlled growth where our institutions are upgrading themselves, maybe with AI, as the stakes become higher and things become faster moving. So anyway, I guess I'll say install a pause button, probably better than not. But the realistic proposal that I think people will get on board with is install a control panel such that a lot of people have visibility into what's going on. There's a lot more transparency, and there's a lot more coordination mechanisms that don't look like people are going to regret signing up to them, both like at the citizen level and at like the state level. And again, this is like, obviously everyone would always love to have this all the time. So it's not a very like choiceful, like controversial take, but I guess I'm trying to say, I don't really like to phrase it in terms of like pause or not. I like to phrase it as like upgrade our like monitoring and control of our whole civilization.
Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on the public discourse around AI doom? Or put another way, what's wrong with other podcasts? How come only Doom Debates is like taking it seriously?
One thing I'll say is that it's just a depressing message, right? Actually, there's something that I've talked to Jeff about is like, he says it's much more fun to give a talk about how amazing medicine is going to be when your AI doctor has seen like 1 million people before. And it's just unpleasant to talk and think about like, oh yeah, we won't be able to compete in the future. We should be scared because we just won't be like important or like really good for anything. It's like, like at best, like if there's like a slow takeoff, right? If we avoid all the like cooker doom scenarios, and it's just really rough topic of conversation.
So Dr. Geoff Hinton agrees that other podcasts are doing a terrible job talking about AI doom and only Doom Debates really gets it.
Right.
You know, just because of that, I think he is actually invited to come on my podcast.
Okay.
If you don't mind passing along that invitation.
I'll pass it on. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, because like I'll give you an example. So there's the Hard Fork podcast. It's the New York Times tech podcast with Kevin Roos and Casey Newton, and they had Miles Brundage on, and they were asking him if he's worried, and are other OpenAI's employees freaking out. So they do kind of bring up the subject, but it just doesn't seem like they're fully doom-pilled. Like there's a missing mood, basically.
Yeah, and it's funny because Miles a couple times mentioned something like, well, if we're still around in the future. And like he's also really pulling his punches, I think, in terms of not addressing the like biggest, scariest outcomes. Although I guess Kevin Roos did just have an article a few weeks ago saying like, I'm actually feeling the AGI now and everyone should prepare. And all the comments were like, you say we should prepare 100 times. What do you mean? Give me one example of what preparing looks like. And I think that's the other part. It's that like, you know, you can't like building a bunker. It's like, okay, better to have it than not. But that's just doesn't help you in any of the like plausible doom scenarios to the extent that we have like fleshed any out. It's just like,
that's bad news for Sam Altman and Peter Thiel.
Well, I mean, I guess I'm saying it like if I was a billionaire, I would definitely have a compound. I don't have enough money for it, but also I don't think that they also think it'll improve their chances of surviving some like bad event all that much.
In fact, Peter Thiel does.
Maybe, yeah.
He seems like he would actually mean to use it. But yeah, I don't mean to make assumptions here.
But concretely, I think that's partly why these discussions die, is because it's like, oh, this big stuff is going to happen. What should we do about it? It's like, well, maybe a few people in think tanks can like come up with some proposals. Everyone else should just be really worried, I guess. Like it's pretty real. I mean, that's why I'm like happy to have at least this like one concrete project is like, think of a good future. But I mean, I just found that very discouraging just in my own, like trying to decide what to do about these things. It's like, oh, better governance, eh? Like, that's like not exactly like something that a professor of computer science is like equipped to do, or again, it's like the least neglected thing in the world in some senses, right?
So this idea that like other podcasts and other media, they just want to keep things positive, or they want to keep things win-win, and they don't want to suddenly inject this mood of like, you know, the movie Don't Look Up, like, hey, we're actually all going to die. Like, we don't want to go crazy about it. You know, I don't think it's just like a bias for positivity, because I don't even really think that that's a thing, right? I think people are more than happy to go negative. In fact, I think that that's a tailwind building my audience for this podcast, is I actually think people naturally do want somebody to alert them of any possible risk that they're getting doomed. I think, though, that it's more like it's more like a frame control thing, where all the AI companies, they just refuse to accept the frame that maybe there's an intractable engineering problem here. right? So that's what you're not allowed to say, is you always have to treat the engineering problem as tractable. Maybe that's what's too painful. So we can talk about like, oh, are we going to engineer it well, or is it not going to go that well? But we can't be like, the whole idea that we're even trying to engineer a solution here to something that is like so hard that we're so clearly doomed on. Really, we should just be pausing and screaming and turning away from this. Like, that's really what you can't say, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's also right. Yeah. Like people want to know what is like some strategy that we can do. And if you just say, I don't have any much to say about strategy, it's not very interesting. I will say, so Ryan Greenblatt is somebody, so he's a junior guy who was one of the co-founders of Redwood Research. A ton of respect for this guy. He was also overlapped with me at Anthropic. He did something I thought was pretty cool, which he posted something on Less Wrong saying the kind of safety cases that Anthropic and other companies will need to make are basically infeasible. Like, it's just not going to be the case that we're like nearly certain that nothing could go wrong with the current plan of like, we're just going to have these evals that we run and these like controlled settings. And he also said, and they shouldn't hold themselves to that standard, because then the best actors would just fall out of the race and it would be even worse from a safety point of view. But I thought that was pretty cool that he was willing to just talk frankly about whether his employer's overall plan was something that was even feasible.
Totally, yeah. Before the show, you sent me a list of people that you thought were brave and other people that you thought were cowards. So Ryan Greenblatt is very much brave.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, yeah. So who else has been brave?
Well, I mean, I guess also Buck Schuglaris is who is like his colleague and co-founder of Redwood Research, just in the sense of looking at the world, saying, what is no one else doing? I'm going to do this thing, even though it seems totally weird.
Mm-hmm. Okay, what about Evan Hubinger?
Yes. So Evan is someone who's now, running a big team at Anthropic and led a lot of the projects that I contributed to that weren't the main ones for my team. And it's just been like hitting home run after home run. So he did something brave, which was he wrote a Less Wrong post before he joined, or when he joined Anthropic, saying, why am I joining Anthropic? Because I think a lot of, from his safety world, people say maybe the worst thing you can do is to join a big lab and make the race go faster. And he basically gave a few reasons to suspect that like overall things might be a positive, like he might be making a net positive action. And he also, one of the reasons I'm like giving a hard time, because he was really honest here, is like to be close to he wanted to be close to the action. And I mean, that's also part of why I went there as well. It's just like, it's just really valuable on a personal level to understand what's happening and see it with your own eyes. And so I thought it was really brave of him to just be honest about that.
Yeah, at PauseAI, we tend to take the position that it's like everybody should just be resigning in protest from these AI companies, even though I do believe you that Anthropic is full of people like yourself who do have half a mind about quitting and do understand that like this is kind of unfortunate that you have this like arms race and it's like hard to look away because somebody else will go do something bad. And so I totally get where you guys are coming from, but I also think that there's much to be said of like, do you guys really have to build the AI? Like, what the hell?
Yeah, like David Kruger gives out pins at conferences, like just don't build AGI, right? And I think that's like, I'm also of two minds, and I'm like, yep, I think you could rightly say like, look, I think you could have just said, I'm not going to join, and maybe if we could somehow scale shame, that would be like just one small technical problem we need to solve to avoid this whole problem.
It's kind of funny because the other day I was actually in San Francisco as part of a PauseAI protest in front of Anthropic's office building, and I was yelling through a megaphone like,
Anthropic AI!
Reckless!
Dario M-Day!
Reckless!
Good guys do not build super intelligence when they don't know how to make it safe.
They don't want to die!
We're not coding software. We're growing a new species.
What do we want?
Save AI!
When do we want it?
Later!
Do we want it in a day?
No!
Do we want it in a year?
No!
Do we want it in a decade?
Maybe!
This company right here is screwing around with artificial intelligence on behalf of our whole species.
So I'm asking you, please, to quit Anthropic. Stop working at Anthropic.
Working!
and I even went so far as to say like, you guys are complacent like the Germans under the Nazis. I was being pretty hyperbolic, but it's kind of funny to think of people in your position hearing that stuff and being like, well, it's kind of true, like receptive to it.
Yeah. Well, and I guess maybe one other brave person is like, in the Manhattan Project, I think there was one engineer who, after it became clear that the war in Europe was not going to be decided by the atom bomb project, he just quit. He was like, well, then why are we here? And just left.
That's right. The only moral person on the Manhattan Project, because it was very notable that basically the original purpose that they sold them all on, right? You're joining the Manhattan Project because Germany's going to get a bomb. And the reason became like, well, we're going to save US soldiers if we drop the bomb on Japan, which wasn't necessarily a bad reason, but it was certainly a change of purpose, right? And most people during that change of purpose are like, okay, yeah, whatever, we'll keep building, right? Whereas one guy was like, no, this is not what I signed up for. And arguably at a place like Anthropic that originally left OpenAI because they wanted to improve on safety, and now they're like a frontier competitor, right, announcing new capabilities developments, there should arguably be a lot of quitting because of that.
Yeah, and it's pretty rough. Like, so I think one thing that people externally and internally make a point of is that Anthropic has the standard equity incentives that most companies have. So one thing that when you join, they explicitly say during the interviews is, you're okay if we send the stock price to 0 because of safety, right? Like that is just table stakes for joining, is that you're not here to get rich. You're like, it's absolutely on the table for us to say, oh, this was a mistake. We're going to unwind the whole thing, right, and I'll go home.
You're not here to get rich, but we do give you a compensation package that arguably has a higher expected value than you're going to make at any possible job offer you're going to get.
Yeah, and a lot of that is equity incentives, especially for the people who joined early.
Yeah.
And so then now, you could argue that, like all the other companies, this has become a misalignment factory where people who were otherwise very thoughtful and were like going to do the right thing. Now it's not only will you potentially lose your most of your life savings if you were to somehow make some costly pause decision, but also everyone around you, right? I think, and in fact, this is something that I discussed with people talked about sometimes was yeah, the hard part about being a whistleblower is not the company being mad at you. It's all your friends and colleagues being mad at you because you messed up their careers.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So I guess I'll say I think, people talked about it as oh, that seems like that was a bad setup. We probably should have used a different incentive scheme. And so that's why I was talking before about how the oversight is, I think, the really load bearing part of if Anthropic is going to do something better than normal corporate behavior, it's because of the long-term benefits trust and the sort of bespoke governance that they set up.
Let's also just review the logic of why they're building capabilities, right? I mean, I want to explicitly touch on that here because it's the whole argument is, look, we can't just have a safety department. We have to have a capabilities department. We have to have our own frontier model. We can't just be like, hey, OpenAI, Google, do you mind letting us have access to it? Which is what a lot of the safety organizations do. They're like, no. We can't just be one of those safety organizations that's getting access to models. We need our own model because we're going to make sure to give ourselves full access to our own model. And also maybe there's going to be a time in the future where our model has to fight other models and we're a better model. So it's good to seize more power for a good model. I mean, that to me, that all sounds pretty flimsy compared to why don't you just not build another frontier model?
Yeah, I will say I want to refine the case, which is more no one will care what we think unless we're one of the frontier labs. And maybe a good control comparison would be Connor Leahy's company Conjecture, where they were we're just going to be a pure safety research lab, and that's what Anthropic started as. And then I think the decision was, we're just going to stand by the sidelines writing papers about safety, and it's not going to matter what we do. And then, of course, the rejoinder to that is well, it's not clear to me. So you're at the front of the race, and now you're going to fall on your sword and say oh, we're not going to release this thing because it's dangerous. Then it didn't matter what you did anyways, because you're just going to be outcompeted at that point.
Yeah, and this really registers to me as a rationalization. They want to do a certain thing, and they feel good doing it, but now they need a reason why they have to do it, so they settle on that. Because the reason you can tell a rationalization is you can compare it to working backwards from what they claim their actual goal is. So if their actual goal is, we just need enough access so that we can do the safety research that we want to do, or that we can, raise the red flags that we want to raise. So why don't you spend all of that multi-billion-dollar resourced effort that you're currently doing at Anthropic, trying to sell your product to people and make money and make your equity go up? Why couldn't you just have taken those same resources and put them toward just having a sane policy where the government just says that the AI labs have to let safety researchers do safety research? How hard is that?
Yeah, well, I think the rejoinder would be, well, they wouldn't have the same resources, and the government wouldn't care what they think.
Right. So I get that. And like it is, this is the thing about rationalizations, right? Is they're always surface level plausible, right? So whenever you have like a Rube Goldberg, like weird way to accomplish some goal, you always are attacking a legitimate problem. Like I agree. There is an incentive for like an OpenAI and a DeepMind to be like, no, go away. You can't see our models. But it's just, if you really care about getting access to those models for safety research, you do have levers you can pull. You just have to put some elbow grease into it. Like if I gave you $1 billion to do it, couldn't you do it? Okay, well, Anthropic's already been burning like multiple billions of dollars, right?
Yeah.
So it does seem like a rationalization situation.
Totally. And I think, so organizations like Beater, like Beth Barnes's Evals company, or Alignment Evans Research Group are examples of sort of maybe what you're proposing a sensible person would actually do is like, okay, I'm not going to build AGI. I'm going to build the infrastructure to help decision makers understand what's going on and do the like sort of basic neglected research.
Yeah, it seems like there's no scaled up AI safety organization. If you consider Anthropic's safety department, that arguably that's like a, multi-100 million funded AI safety department. But you got to wonder, why has nobody been able to have like $100 million safety organization outside of that? But maybe that's Future of Life Institute. I mean, they're pretty well funded.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know how many employees they have. I mean, I guess I'll say I think the UK AC had that vision. And there's a scope for like another government in the future to try to do AC on steroids where they actually pay competitive salaries. Like the big sell of AC was just government without the bureaucracy. I think that I was pretty impressed with the hiring that they managed to do. But, they do have the cream skimmed to some extent by the big labs just because they pay more and they're more exciting.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this discussion is notable because we're not just two people chatting. You were on the inside, right? You had all the credentials. You were being recruited by these companies. You went into the inside and you're like, yep, the incentives aren't great. Like people have equity in making money, not in slowing down. They would disappoint their friends if they lobbied for slowing down or blew the whistle in any way. And like, yep, other AI companies care less about safety than the one I was in. And even the one I was in is not like seriously considering not building capabilities. So it's good to just get your confirmation from the inside of like, yeah, there's not something missing in this account that us outsiders are saying.
Yeah, I would basically say that your overall picture, I think, is something I'd agree with. Actually, another brave person that comes to mind is Jade Lung, who left OpenAI's policy team to go be head of the UK AC, or like I'm not sure exactly what her title is, but she walked away from the millions and
really
did the government thing. Yeah,
she walked away from millions.
Well, okay, I don't know the situation with like her equity or whatever, but the point is like I think she was in a good spot within the company, and I think
was this Anthropic or OpenAI?
This was OpenAI.
So she walked away from OpenAI. She had millions of, I guess, unvested equity, and she walked away to become the CTO of the United Kingdom's AI Safety Institute. I'm just reading Wikipedia.
Yeah, correct.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. And it seems reasonable that OpenAI wouldn't like accelerate her equity vesting. It's not like they tried to claw back equity. They just kind of told her this is the deal. Like the longer you stay here, the more equity you get. But the nature of those kind of deals is the company got like 100 times more valuable, and she could have just stayed and kept that super sweetheart deal. So that is actually extremely impressive to quit at that time.
Yeah, and I talked to her a bit about it after she left and asking why, and she said, "Oh, like it wasn't any one thing in particular. It was just that," and she said that like it just started acting more and more like a normal big company. And she said they did a lot of stuff that when she was there, the arguments made sense. Like, oh yeah, we have to do this capability stuff so that we will be at the frontier, da da da. But that as soon as she took off her employee hat and put on her public interest hat, she's like, no, this is crazy.
Yeah. And remember Daniel Kokotajlo, he's on your list of brave people here. When he quit, I remember the exact quote that he posted on Less Wrong was, or I guess I'm paraphrasing, but it was like, he didn't think that OpenAI was going to behave responsibly or prudently at the time of the intelligence explosion.
Yeah. And he has a lot of theories about what the internal politics would look like at these big companies when some like sort of like maybe even like soft takeoff starts to happen. And he was basically, I talked to him at the time around when he left, like before and after, and he was saying something like, yes, these like even Anthropic might be filled with like really well-meaning, sensible people who are like, it's like kind of a hippie kind of place. And I think there's a whole bunch of people there that'll be like, I'm going to be the guy that like, bravely stands against the tide of history to like make sure things are safe, right? Like that's kind of like the lionized thing. But he's kind of saying, well, probably there'll be some sort of fallow internally where like maybe there's some government people involved in like, just the small team of engineers that are needed to like run this smaller thing. And so it won't even be visible to like the great masses of like potential whistleblowers. They're just going to be like left in the dark for like the crucial few months or whatever. And I don't
Right.
really know. I haven't really spent as much time as he has thinking about how plausible this is, but like, there are ways around any governance mechanism, and I guess we've kind of seen that with OpenAI's like board drama.
Yeah, but so his position is even when OpenAI had a board that cared more about safety before they're kind of one by one getting more business-friendly people, let's say, compared to, I don't know, people who care about safety. Even back then, when the board actually cared more about safety, Daniel's argument is like, well, the board still is kind of powerless to see a lot of these unsafe projects before it's too late.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice. Okay. And finally, on your list of brave people, talk about Leopold Aschenbrenner.
Oh, I mean, I guess. So I was talking before about how it's like, it's really scary to sound the alarm without a plan. And I guess he was someone who, I don't know, I guess I didn't put him down in the brave category in the sense that he was like, I'm going to sound the alarm and say like the government should securitize everything. And if you really think that weights being stolen and some sort of like, Siberian like catastrophe is like the most important thing to worry about, maybe that makes sense. But I kind of felt like it's really waking the dragon. And of course now it's like the cat's out of the bag. The security people are taking AI seriously. But it was like, there's like the unilateralist curse that Nick Bostrom talks about. It's like, if you're the first guy who's going to like do the thing, probably you're just like doing the wrong thing. I don't know.
So with Leopold Aschenbrenner, it was obviously super brave of him to start alerting people about safety issues in OpenAI. And then he got let go and he wrote situational awareness and it became super popular. And like you said, he's kind of waking up the sleeping giant in terms of like all these random people who weren't thinking that much about AI, like people in the government, for instance, they kind of got really excited, like, oh, wow, this is going to be like such an imminent arms race between us and China. And the funny thing is, as you say, Leopold kind of took that energy and he just put it in the framing of like, yep, it's an arms race. It's all about which human has like more mastery over the AI. And that's going to help our offense and our defense, both sides of the war. And it's like, wait a minute. If you're going to wake up all these people to how powerful AI is, you got to tell them about like misalignment and loss of control. And he really fumbled that from our perspective.
Well, I mean, I would say, yeah, just completely dismissed it, right? I think there's just like a single line. It's like, well, we obviously can't be EACs and we obviously can't be these like safety ninnies. And I was just like, oh man, that's just like an extremely disappointing fumble or like deliberate dismissal.
Yeah. And in terms of like how many people you woke up, I remember before the election, Ivanka Trump was tweeting like the PDF being like, oh, wow, this is like a really great paper. And at that time I was like, okay, so is this like good? Does that mean the Trump administration is going to like understand these issues? But it doesn't seem like it.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, like there was like the thing where Vance said like, AIs are not going to replace humans or something. And it's like, there's just going to be so much cope. I think my prediction, my mainline scenario is like so much disappointing cope because I already see it from so many brilliant people that I otherwise respect on like almost any other topic. And then they just say the most like head in sand is going to be fine kind of things. And I think, I think everyone a year or two from now is just going to be freaked out about jobs. That's like all anyone's going to want to talk about basically.
Right. That is true. That's very interesting. But just, when you make these kind of claims, it's funny. I can see the character assassinations coming because I do feel like the non-doomers, they like to find every angle where they're like, well, this guy doesn't really know machine learning. Okay. He's just a doomer who reads too much sci-fi, but no, you can't say that about David. He's got the really rock solid machine learning credentials. So maybe they would just have to paint you with a brush of like, well, David is just a pessimist. And he's always just believed in AI doom. And even when he went and worked at an AI company, he was just like a doomer infiltrating it on the inside. And maybe that's how they would try to character assassinate you.
Well, I mean, so I've definitely become a little bit worried that is the case. And I mean, obviously just like on a personal level, I'm like very like positive, but I was like, if I'm the most doomy person at this like company of people who have spent their adult lives thinking about it, probably I'm just wrong. On the other hand, everyone has an incentive to not actually take these other kind of risks that we aren't addressing seriously. So maybe there's like motivated cognition. And then me just being someone who's like, coming for a visit is in like better position to be like, hey, maybe we're missing something big. I don't know. It's obviously a very self-serving narrative, but I guess
but were you really the number one most doom-pilled? You don't think there are more doom-pilled people?
It's funny. I guess I talked to a lot of people who I thought were very smart and took the risks really seriously. And then when I talked to them about like, what is your job going to be, what's the role for humanity, why isn't the government just going to take this and make it serve its own ends or something, they just didn't. Okay, there's a lot of head in the sand, and then there's some smart people who just had this intuition that coordination is easy to solve on an individual level, and maybe this empirical crux of if everyone has AI, we can probably get along with each other better in some ways. Also, the state and all the like apparatuses and like power gathering mechanisms above us will also have an easier time coordinating and monitoring and stuff. So it's not really clear which of these effects is going to be larger. And I think some of them had the intuition that, hey, we will just like not even need the government as much, or we'll just be able to see what's going on and have like distributed sense making.
Right. I get that, but I'm just curious. You don't think that there were a few people there who are so like, nope, we're all doomed. This is like overwhelming. More of like a my position or an Eliezer position. Nobody was like that at all.
If there were, I didn't find them because I looked and this was like my use.
Oh, geez, that's okay. That's a bit of a negative update for me. I mean, I get that there's a selection bias where people like me maybe are more likely to join PauseAI than Anthropic, but I mean, Daniel Kokotajlo worked at OpenAI, and he's come on record saying he has, I think, a 60% PDUM. I forgot if it was 60% or higher, but very high. And he worked at OpenAI, and I think there were other people like him. So it's almost like you're telling me that Anthropic doesn't even have people at that level of PDUM.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that I just think most people haven't put that much thought into it. And I actually talked with Ryan Greenblatt a little bit about this. I'm less wrong, actually, after I wasn't there anymore. Just basically saying like it's so nuts to me that most people haven't thought that hard about this, and he has these like very, I don't want to say out there, but like not business as usual scenarios where it's like, yes, there's like maybe a one-time global renegotiation of power, and this has to happen before the oceans literally boil because there's so many computers like running, and I'm like, this is amazing, this is what I was looking for the whole time. How come never our colleagues have talked about this? And maybe we can put a link to this thread later. And he's like, yeah, I agree. Most people just don't think about this very much. But to be fair to them, this kind of futurism is hard to do, hard to check, and it probably doesn't matter very much for what most people are doing.
I see this as a pretty big bombshell revelation that you don't think anybody working at Anthropic today could pretty easily tell you that they have a higher than 50% PDUM.
Oh, I don't. I was saying, I thought you were asking about higher than my 85%.
Oh, okay. I mean, I think 50% is actually plenty.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, and I guess I'll say there's a bunch of people who really had thought this too. Like again, like Evan Huminger as like, he's like, oh yeah, like runaway competition would be like a bad end, and
right.
Like,
okay, I understand why there may have been a misunderstanding in the way I asked the question, because your PDUM really is quite high when you say 85%. So I guess when I ask, like, you don't think anybody's more doom-pilled than you, that would have to be, like, pretty damn doom-pilled. I mean, I think you start getting into overconfident land once you start going too far above 85%.
Yeah, and it's like, this 15% is like, we all have an incentive, and we have a chance to not do this. So, maybe 15% is, like, a little bit low. Maybe I'd say, like, 80% if I you meditate on all the brilliant people who are going to have a chance to try to revert this.
I mean, do you remember when Dario said on that interview, he said 10 to 25%, and later he walked it back. He's like, oh, I wasn't even talking about doom. I was talking about civilization being transformed or something. So be that as it may, do you think there's a lot of people who are kind of like that, but their number would be more like 50%?
I think most people's stance was there are a bunch of risks, including like vague societal risks. That's why we need to solve alignment. And basically solving alignment will be necessary and sufficient. And so we didn't really have to think much more about it because we all agreed we were going to solve alignment was sort of the epistemic state overall.
Okay. Let's talk about some of the cowards.
Okay. Well, we'll see.
All right. So I think some aspect of Ilya Sutskever's behavior could be described as cowardly. Do you agree?
I don't know. I mean, well, let's be specific. I mean, I guess I thought it was pretty cool when he like publicly took a stand and then ended up pissing everyone off and getting kicked out of his own company.
Yeah, and so my understanding is when he took a stand, he realized the stakes were high, and part of that is because he's safety pilled. He realized a lot is at stake. But I think the main reason he took a stand from the reporting I've been reading is just because Sam Altman is just crossing too many lines of like when you're a CEO and you're playing the board against each other and doing like standard Machiavellian tactics, but not successfully getting away with it because the board realized he was like playing them and just literally not being honest, like their exact quote, not being consistently candid. Like that seemed to be just very much literally true. It seems like that's why Ilya was like, okay, he has to go.
Yeah. I mean, I just read the Gwern stuff, but like I don't have like insider knowledge to that drama. I guess I'll say, before all that happened, like I think was spending political capital. I mean, he's a co-founder, but like, he organized that conference where he had invited like a bunch of academics and like safety people. And, we were there and like, he was there representing OpenAI and we were all giving him a hard time. We're like, oh yeah, like these crazy AI companies are like on this race to build AGI. This is crazy. And like, he kind of just like took the abuse and like had spent the capital to organize that and have, give Jan like a cover for the super alignment team and extract these concessions. But I don't know much about the internal political economy of
Yeah, the
OpenAI.
conference you were referring to, was this like an AI safety like research paper presentation type conference?
Yeah, basically, yeah. And it's online. It's like, I think it was like February 2023.
Yeah, I think I watched those videos, and my takeaway was the one lightning talk from somebody who, it was almost like a parody, but he had this slide up and there was like this graph where he's like, look, the smarter the AIs get, the less coherent they get. So we actually think there's an inverse relationship between intelligence and coherence. And I'm
Yeah,
like, are you kidding me? And
yep.
you had like these random data points. I don't know what you remember.
No, so that's Yasha Schulderstein, and he's like a colleague of mine and like contemporary, and he actually went to Anthropic after that from Google. And he's actually one of the people who invented the diffusion model, like the main vision model that people use today, or the main like generative image models. His hot mess theory, that basically the more intelligent an agent is, the less coherent it is. And I actually have long email threads with him back and forth about this exact point. And I'm saying, they're like, I think that, there's a real phenomenon here, but it's not something we can bank on for these reasons.
I mean, yeah, a real phenomenon. Not really. I mean, talk about missing the point.
Yeah, I mean, my main point was like agency is the thing that's stable by definition. And so if there is a hot mess, it will be subverted by something that is like a coherent agent.
Right, exactly. It's like we all agree you can make a hot mess, you can make incoherent agents of any scale. That's even part of the orthogonality thesis, right? It even says you can have incoherent agents at any scale. They just fall by the wayside where they start to care about doing something, in which case they're like, well, let me make a sub-agent that's more coherent, or else they just get passed by some other agent that's more coherent. Like I think we both agree, like you don't get to like have a stable defense by an incoherent hot mess.
Exactly. And and I guess I'll say, in Yasha's defense, like there was a bunch of people there who were like these like normie researchers who were, this was like dipping their toes into this water, and they don't really have much to contribute except for like their half-baked ideas about how this could all work. So this was kind of a like show and tell, like, hey, you're like really good in your own field. Maybe try to think about this other issue that's been super confusing.
Yeah, I mean, good on Ilya for organizing the conference. It just, when I saw it, it just confirmed my suspicions of like, look, Eliezer Yudkowsky has actually been thinking about this quite deeply and productively since 2000 or something like that. And I've been reading his writings, and I've developed a lot of pretty good concepts about safety, or like I've learned from him. And then I see this conference and I'm like, okay, here we are 20 years later, and people can't even, they can't even compare with the stuff that Eliezer was publishing in the 2000s. And this is like modern safety from like this multi-billion-dollar company that's close to having a superhuman intelligence. And their safety talk is like, you need to go to like Eliezer 101 over here.
I agree. I mean, in their defense, I guess I'll say Eliezer 101 talk is very totalizing and all or nothing, in the sense that it's like, the safe thing is no AI. If you have AI, you're just like screwed, basically, unless you have done some galaxy brain alignment work.
Yeah.
And so these guys are in the middle where they're like, well, we have something that's kind of AI, it's kind of aligned. What's our next step? And so if I think it would have been cool to invite Eliezer, but I think if he was there, it would have been like, you're maniacs, shut it all down. And it's like, well, we're not going to do that.
Right. Okay. So it sounds like Ilya is relatively brave, just because he is, trying to push things in the right direction, and he's not just following the crowd. He's trying to lead a little bit, telling people to feel the AGI. We approve of that. Maybe he's not cowardly, but I certainly disapprove of what he's doing with safe superintelligence, which is he feels the need to start his own organization and to tell people that they're prioritizing making it safe, and they're not even going to launch it until it's safe and it's super intelligent. But if that's the case, why not go on record and criticize everybody else for not doing that, right? Because he's contradicting himself. If what you're doing is so necessary, then go criticize other people. Don't stay quiet.
I mean, yeah. So I guess the one thing I'll say is, if you want to be somebody that other people want to work with, if you ever like whistleblow and like, pull the alarm and be like, hey, everyone around me is betraying you, like they suck, you're basically done, because like people don't necessarily trust you anymore. And I mean, you might say, whatever, if it's the ratio that high, that's what you should be doing. And I think that's a fair argument. I guess I'll just say, like, it would go against my instincts. I would be like, well, it's not good what that would accomplish. Also, everyone's going to hate me. He already kind of pissed everyone off, just like trying to thread the needle during the board drama.
I would actually call that cowardly then, right? Because if he's afraid of criticism, then he's being a coward in that sense.
Yeah,
all right, I said it, not yet.
Yeah, sure. The other part of this is that people who have run AI labs, that's sort of all they know how to do. And it's bad leadership in the sense of betraying your subordinates and your colleagues if you start saying like, hey, maybe we're the baddies, maybe we're doing the wrong thing. Like think of someone like running a big lab at Meta, and they become kind of safety pilled, and then they start saying like, oh man, maybe this is all like kind of backwards. Like now when you're like doing corporate politics and someone else is like, hey, I want to take over the lab, you're like a weak leader or whatever, right? Like, or your subordinates are like, hey, I want to pitch this project. Now everyone is suddenly in like a much worse position. But and the other thing is that like these people, that's their expertise. And so like Yoshua Bengio, for instance, I think we see things pretty similarly. But his plan for solving safe AGI is like build a new AGI lab, but safe, kind of like Anthropic. And it's just like, a real like hammer searching for a nail kind of behavior. And I guess, I also was doing similar thing when I was like, I'm going to do technical alignment work at Anthropic because I'm a technical guy. I can do technical work. That's how I can contribute.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's what you're saying about most of the big professors and industry leaders. For instance, Jeff Dean, they just keep their heads down and they say we have to balance the risks and the benefits, which I empathize with that. It's easy. I mean, I could easily see myself being like, look, I like working on the tech. It's great that people are talking about implications of safety and how to govern it. Like, I wish them the best of luck. I'm just working on the tech. My job is to be an engineer. We've got a distribution of responsibilities here. And that's even kind of what Geoffrey Hinton was saying until recently, right?
Yeah. And it's funny because I have a hard time remembering any specific comments he made about this, like before his big change of heart. And then I think he was in a relatively favorable position in the sense that like he was like, the lab was going to be like in okay hands without him. And like he wasn't retired by any stretch of the imagination, but like he wasn't going to be like giving up mid-career his like big dream. It's like he had kind of like won the sort of like academic recognition game already.
Right. Okay. Yeah, and that's, you could argue, well, he had an easier time saying that because he was already at the top of his field, but then again, he did kind of undermine his field too, so I wouldn't say it was that easy to say that.
Well, exactly. No, I'm not trying to take anything away from what Jeff said. I guess I'm trying to say, it's also easy for me to say because I like had tenure and then I could like go and try something totally crazy, right? And there's still the thing where like, there's a bunch of, you can't really have a good salary as a professor. You have to have like side jobs. So there's still like a reason why you want to just like keep your head down and be like, when you improve capabilities, everyone's happy, right? They're like, yay, you made the thing better. You showed your technical prowess. You bring glory to us all. When you start being this kind of like activist thing, like I normally loathe those like people who are like, oh, like, are we sure like this is a good idea? And it's kind of like, oh, it's just so easy to do that, right? Anyway, so I was just trying to say, it's really hard to do it if you're like a young person just starting out trying to make a name for themselves to like forsake the capabilities, the lure of capabilities.
Right, exactly. So somebody like a Jeff Dean, if he wants to play the card of, look, I'm just an engineer, you guys debate policy and let me know what you come up with. I'm neutral on this, right? I just want to do the work. I want to do my assignments. I would argue that it's actually not that neutral because the problem is if you already know that one of the outcomes of the debate is you are actively helping destroy the world. And you're just like, look, maybe I'm actively helping destroy the world. Maybe I'm not. Let me know and get back to me. And then one of the possible outcomes is like, okay, Jeff, we've decided that you are destroying the world and you need to stop. Like, you need to find a different job. It seems like those people are biased against this outcome of like, nope, we've decided you're destroying the world. And so implicitly they're saying, I just have a low enough PDoom. You see what I'm saying? You can't really step aside from the argument. You just have to decide that you're going to act as if PDoom is low.
I mean, I totally agree. And then I guess I'll just say to defend the people who just want to keep their head down and work. They're like, oh yeah, but that's what they say about global warming. Like our data centers are melting the ice caps or whatever. And like,
yeah,
you kind of, I think the position that most people take is like, that's for governance to worry about. Like if we're all polluting, then we need to all sign a contract that we're not going to pollute. Don't ask me to unilaterally fall on my sword to fix the world's problems. And I mean, I guess I think that's a reasonable enough position that I'm just like, I'm not going to try to go around like shaming my individual colleagues. I'm going to try to make a, coordinated action where we all agree like, hey, you like, don't blame me, blame the government, but you guys all have to stop working on this dangerous thing or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. You know what? I am actually sympathetic to some people being like, nope, I insist on being heads down, let other people figure it out. As long as they're not also putting in subtle digs against like, I'm not a doomer, doomers are so lame. It's like, no, you said you were out of the discussion. Like that's being in the discussion.
Yeah, no, that has been a huge disappointment. Like Andrew Ng and Jan LeCun, like in particular, just feeling the need to dunk on people in ways that they're making arguments that they just know are bad arguments.
Andrew Ng is kind of playing both sides, right? He's like, look, I'm just an engineer. I'm not in this policy debate, but the policy makes no sense to me because clearly we're not doing right. Isn't he kind of playing both sides?
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not even that hard on because he mostly hasn't talked about it except when he's asked, and then to dismiss
Yeah.
it. And then like Jan LeCun has made a point of being like, no, this is ridiculous. And I personally have had discussions with him about this, and he just changes his position and dances around and be like, maybe it's good to destroy society.
Oh
just
man,
like
you personally have had discussions on this. See, people need to hear those kind of discussions, right? So if you ever want to bring him back, I can moderate.
Sure, lots of them are on Facebook, but it's just the sort of thing where like,
Yeah.
it's very unsatisfying because he'll just make like a kind of provocative, outlandish claim, and then you'll be like, well, here's the sensible version of it. What do you think of that? And then he'll just kind of like not engage with it. So it's like, there was never like this like meaty debate. It's just kind of like provocative claim, attempted follow-up, and then another dismissal sort of thing.
Yeah, so Andrew Ng, Jan LeCun, and Fei Li, I think the three of those, we agree that it's kind of shocking how weak their arguments are. Like, why are you even entering the discussion if this is your argument? But they seem like they're convinced by their own weak arguments.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't want to psychologize people that I don't know all that well. Like, I've only met Fei once and felt like she was making 4 arguments, but like, yeah, I mean, people talk their books, but I don't know, I have much more to say about it than that.
Bringing it toward the close here, let's talk a little bit more about gradual disempowerment, because to review, your mainline scenario is something like white collar work just turns into make work, and then blue collar work just turns into make work too, kind of like the dock workers. Like, we could just have robots replace it if we actually wanted to, and then you get a universal basic income, and we tie that to time-consuming hobbies. So we really double down on make work just to, I guess, keep the population complacent. That's kind of how you see things playing out in your mainline gradual disempowerment scenario?
Yep. And basically, anyone who has enough to lose maybe can avoid this, but, and I don't exactly have strong opinions on the form this takes. Like, it could be a patchwork of sinecures where it's like, you have to have a human lawyer approve your contract, and so they just get paid to like, click farm, like approve stuff. And like same with doctors. And there's enough of this that everyone can live off these like few like, humans who have jobs by fiat. Or it could be that like whenever you protest sufficiently disruptively, you have to do community service. And then that's like, to stay out of jail, you have to like show that you're doing something that is like productive, but it might just be something as simple as like speed running video games or anything that's time consuming and keeps you out of trouble. Because I just don't think it's stable to have a whole bunch of people without jobs, basically.
It is crazy. And my takeaway from this conversation has just been that connection between economic doom and existential doom. I don't think about the connection too much. And I know Andrew Critch tried to make that point. It just normally for me, it's like such separate dooms, the doom of like, well, the AI just like slaps you away because it can just like control your atoms. Essentially, it can just like engineers so many powerful things that you just have no power, compared to like, no, I mean, you have power in the economy, but it's just the AI can just do all your jobs. So you just have to do make work basically. And now you're really just dependent on the government for every shred of like food and resources that you get. And you really just have to beg, like you don't really have any leverage whatsoever. And the next day you just wake up and something has changed, like one way or the other. So economic doom is, I guess, closely related actually to existential doom, even though it's easy to say in the short term, like, isn't this a good problem to have? Universal basic income to solve it. And you're saying like, well, if you actually think through all this make work economy, it's like super unstable. All right. So then my last question for you is, let's try to be productive here. What can we do about this?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say my mainline scenario is that actually we get some way along this economic disempowerment before there is some faster, more agentic disempowerment. And I don't really have strong opinions about when that happens. But it's more of a response to people saying, why would we all agree to build a world that we don't like? Why wouldn't the government just solve these problems? It's like, why did North Koreans build a government that they hate? Like, they didn't do it on purpose. It's like,
yeah, you got locked in.
Yeah. So, but as for what we can do about it, one thing we can do is just to try to understand the actual power dynamics of our civilization better. Like, we have competition operating at all these levels. And I think what's becoming clear to a lot of people is there isn't really anyone driving the bus at the top level. And again, that's been okay so far because, you always need humans as gas to run whatever kind of bus ends up getting driven and wherever it gets driven. So really, we've sort of been flying blind, but it's sort of like, it doesn't really matter where we fly. And then all of a sudden,
the gas also can grab the wheel a little bit.
A little bit. But I mean, it's not, So that's the big question is like, how much can you grab it? Like maybe one empirical question is, what are the actual stable states in the long run? Is it this sort of like competition where we expect just like the fittest replicator to dominate, and then there's a bunch of like self-replicating robots going out to the stars? Or, you could say, no, but like governments form, states form automatically. No one had to like really plan for that to happen. So maybe the more stable thing is like agency at the top level. And we should expect that, 9 civilizations out of 10 end up forming some like global government that like just kind of lasts forever. Or, maybe this is like when people do game theory and they're like, come up with these really simple policies because they can't actually do the like complicated thing to model the like actual possible equilibria. And the fact that our current government isn't a world government, it's this like weird multipolar thing that's like, when a party gets too powerful, often the party will split in half, where there's like all these dynamics that keep things in this sort of like funny, chaotic equilibrium. Maybe that's sort of the natural state of things. It's this like almost missing field of how do civilizations steer themselves? And we don't really understand what's going on, I'd say. So that's one thing that I'm kind of like, my next thing that I'm going to try to do is try to sort of get this field to exist. And there's a lot of like really great thinkers already working in it, but they somehow don't end up talking to each other as much as I think they should.
You're saying we don't have this crutch where just needing to hire workers already gives us all these good incentives to like compensate the workers and, have everybody benefit from trade. Like that's going to be gone. And so even if you don't assume that the agency is going to be in some misaligned AI that then takes the world away from us, even if you don't assume that, you just have a bunch of people with their own chunk of power and they just have to play power games. And even if it's just all humans who have power, it's just like, okay, well, how does the power get coordinated, right? And that's basically what you're saying is like this unsolved problem because it's just never been a practical problem.
Exactly. Yep.
Interesting. So do you think that's going to be like your main focus thinking about that stuff?
I guess I'll say, I think I'm relatively well positioned in the sense that I'm somebody who is well known enough that I think I can get the people in the same room to talk about it and like cares about it and has freedom to spend his political capital on like whatever crazy crap that doesn't seem appealing to other people. So that is something I'm hoping to spend the next 6 months or a year on.
All right, Professor David Duvenaud, this has been fantastic. Thanks so much for coming on Doom Debates. And I really appreciate this tour that you're doing, getting the message out with your credentials as a researcher with a really successful history and somebody who's been on the inside as a team lead at Anthropic. It's so helpful to lend credibility to people who are trying to get the message out of like, hey, we don't have much time. It seems like we're doomed. Like we really got to take this seriously. So thank you so much for doing all that.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Hope you enjoyed that episode with Professor David Duvenaud. If you want to get more Doom Debates in your feed, go to your podcast player, search Doom Debates, subscribe to the podcast. Go to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/@DoomDebates, smack the subscribe button on YouTube. And most importantly of all, go to doomdebates.com. That's where I have my Substack. Type in your email, smack that enter button. You got to get on my Substack because sometimes there's special content that only the Substack people see. If you want to go above and beyond and get first access to the premium features that I'm going to launch at some point, you can pledge $10 a month or whatever arbitrary amount feels right to you. And the premium features are going to be pretty cool. It's going to be like bonus content of me preparing stuff like that. I do intend to be investing more time and money into the show as time goes on and the audience grows. If you want to be a guest, I know it's hard to come on after David Duvenaud, but if you want to give it a shot, just shoot me an email, wiseguy@gmail.com, or DM me at Liron. We'll try to make it happen. The schedule of guests is getting pretty juicy. That's it for today, but stay tuned because as you know, in the next few days, we're going to have another high-quality discussion helping raise awareness about existential risk from superintelligent AI right back here on Doom Debates.